Hey there, curious minds. Tonight, we're diving deep into the biting winds and smoky hearths of medieval Iceland, where staying warm wasn't just a matter of comfort, it was a question of survival. You're standing just outside a turf house, its low, moss-covered roof practically swallowed by snowdrifts, the entrance a narrow tunnel designed more to trap heat than to welcome visitors. Your boots crunch softly on the frozen earth, and every breath curls out like dragon smoke, instantly snatched by the wind. You duck inside, barely, and the world changes. Light flickers on soot-dark walls. The air is thick with the scent of old wool, wood smoke, and whatever's boiling in the pot over the hearth. Warmth, such as it is, huddles near the fire, a glow that never quite reaches the far corners of the room. Every inch of this space fights for heat like a prized secret. And you, tender modern soul, would not survive an hour here without learning their tricks. Quick favor, before you dive into full-on relaxation mode, consider liking and subscribing. It helps more than you know, and I genuinely appreciate it if you do. If not, no worries, I'm just glad you're here. Feel free to post your location and what time it is where you're listening. I love seeing how far this journey reaches. Wherever you are, I'm glad you're here. Let's take a moment to leave the noise of the day behind. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You lean a little closer to the fire, but not too close. It's just a modest blaze, barely enough to warm your hands, and someone had to coax it into life this morning with precious birch bark and patience. Wood is rare here, not because they didn't want it, but because it simply didn't exist in large quantities on this icy island. Vikings might have been tough, but even they couldn't chop down a tree that wasn't there. That's where turf houses come in, a marvel of cold weather architecture born of desperation and brilliance. Inside, the walls of this house are layers of earth, moss, stones, and wooden ribs scavenged from shipwrecks or driftwood hauled in by the sea. These aren't homes in the way you think of homes. They're living, breathing wombs of warmth nestled into the land itself. You don't live on the land here. You live in it. Turf walls can be over a meter thick, acting like a thermos. And though they're damp dim and attract every kind of bug you can imagine, they also insulate like a dream. Above you, the roof is low, partly to keep heat from drifting too high, and partly because Icelandic winters have a cruel sense of humor. When the wind screams like a chorus of banshees and the snow falls sideways, you want a roof that hugs you back. And yet, despite this careful design, it never gets truly warm inside. It gets less cold. That's the goal. A house wasn't a beach vacation. It was a shelter against the howling void. You glance around the room. There's no furniture as you know it. Just platforms covered in sheepskins where the family sleeps shoulder to shoulder. No privacy, no fluff, and definitely no mattress ads offering a 100-night trial. You sleep close because that's how bodies stay alive. And forget central heating. The hearth is life. It sits right in the center, a blackened cauldron hanging above it, bubbling with something that smells suspiciously like yesterday's leftovers. The walls are streaked with soot, centuries of fires with no chimney, just a hole in the roof where the smoke lingers and escapes at its leisure. You sit near the hearth and notice something strange. Your face warms, but your back still freezes. It's an ancient Icelandic riddle. How do you warm the whole body with a fire that only touches the front? The answer? You don't. You just keep rotating like a roast chicken, or wear enough layers to make your own heat bubble. Because if there's one thing medieval Icelanders understood, it's that fire is precious and never wasted. They even had firekeepers, usually women, who mastered the art of banking embers in ash to keep the coals alive until morning. No fire starting each day, no sir. That would burn through too much fuel and patience. Instead, the fire smolders all night, tucked beneath ashes like a dragon beneath a blanket. If it dies, you might need to borrow a spark from the neighbor. a humiliating and time-consuming ordeal that involved walking through a blizzard with a cup full of smoldering disappointment. And speaking of dragons, did I mention they believed in spirits that lived in the firestones? These weren't just lumps of basalt. They were protectors, sometimes tricksters, and always respected. You didn't spit into the hearth, and you definitely didn't curse near it. Historians still argue whether these hearth spirits were part of older Norse beliefs or something uniquely Icelandic. Either way, you tread lightly near the flames. Magic and warmth weren't so different back then. You notice a child curled up near the hearth's edge, cradling a carved wooden toy, probably handed down from a dozen siblings before him. His cheeks are ruddy from the cold, his hair matted from woolen caps that never come off indoors. You watch as someone ladles thick stew into a horn bowl. It's made with barley, root vegetables, and maybe a little lamb fat if they're lucky. A single bowl of hot stew could mean the difference between sleep and frostbite. The steam hits your face like a soft kiss from a boiling ghost. You inhale deeply and realize this isn't just food, it's warmth you can swallow. And let's talk about socks. Wool socks, to be exact. These weren't dainty Christmas decorations. They were survival gear, scratchy and hand-knit from the shaggiest sheep you've ever seen, often double-layered, sometimes stuffed with, you guessed it, moss. The goal was simple: trap body heat, repel moisture, and avoid becoming a human icicle. Your boots, probably made from sealskin or reindeer hide with enough fur inside to smother a small dog. Not fashionable, but you're not here for looks. You're here to not die of exposure. And you can't help but notice, despite the gloom and cold, there's laughter here. People talking softly over the fire, passing wooden cups of fermented whey, telling stories of trolls that live in the hills and ghosts that ride the northern lights. There's warmth in those stories, too. In a place where daylight disappears for months and the cold is a living thing that watches you sleep, stories become survival. They keep the mind warm when the body fails. But the fire's low now, the stew pot nearly empty. A woman tucks embers under ash with a practiced hand. You pull your borrowed furs closer and lie down on the hard platform. Above you, the smoke hole glows faintly with moonlight. You can still hear the wind outside, but here, in this strange, moss-wrapped house, the world has narrowed to breathe, warmth, and the flickering ghost of firelight on the walls. And somehow, despite everything, you're safe. You wake to the scent of smoke and something vaguely sour, the sound of low voices already murmuring in the shadows. Your breath clouds in front of your face. The fire's embers are still alive, thanks to that careful ash banking trick, but they're barely warm now, just enough to keep frost from claiming the insides of your nose. You sit up stiffly, the furs creaking like old doors around you. And now you start to really see it. The house around you isn't just shelter, it's strategy. And it all starts with the walls. Forget timber-framed mansions or thick stone castles. Those don't work out here. Trees, not exactly growing in abundance on this volcanic rock of an island. Stones, good for a foundation maybe, but they lose heat faster than a spilled tankard of ale. What you need is insulation. Layers, soft, forgiving, and oddly fragrant insulation. So what did Icelanders use instead of wood or stone for most of their homes? Turf. Literal chunks of ground sliced into manageable bricks like a giant earthy lasagna, with each layer carefully stacked like a green, squishy Jenga tower. The result? A wall that breathes. One that keeps the heat in, the wind out, and occasionally grows mushrooms on. The inside if you're lucky. And when you press your hand against it, it feels like leaning into a living thing. Damp, spongy, but somehow comforting. Turf houses weren't unique to Iceland. They appear in parts of Ireland, Scotland, and Greenland too, but no one took them to quite the same extreme. Icelanders didn't just build with turf, they lived in it. The walls could be over a meter thick, made with alternating layers of mossy turf, gravel, and earth, resting on a base of stones for drainage. The result was more hobbit hole than house, blending into the land like it had always been there. In fact, if you squint from a distance, the roofs just look like extra hills. Sometimes goats would graze up there, blissfully unaware they were nibbling someone's ceiling. Inside, the turf kept things strangely consistent. It never got warm, exactly, but it didn't drop to deadly cold either. The temperature hovered in the survivable range, which is about all you could hope for during a snowstorm that lasts 5 days. And the best part? Turf was free. All you needed was a spade, patience, and the understanding that your walls might occasionally sprout mossy souvenirs. But like everything in life, there were trade-offs. Turf houses were dark, damp, and prone to leaking. You wouldn't exactly call them cheerful. Windows were rare and tiny, often covered with animal stomach lining instead of glass. The smell was earthy, and not in a spa-like woodland moss kind of way, more like bog corpse meets sheep sweat. But when the wind howled like a choir of ghosts outside and snow buried the world in white silence, these turf homes held strong. One room was usually set aside as the bath stofa, the main living space where everyone did everything. Sleeping, weaving, eating, praying, storytelling, shivering. It was the heart of the house, both in function and heat. And because insulation was the game, these rooms were often built with low ceilings to trap what little warmth there was. The smaller the room, the warmer the people. Which means, yes, you're going to be very close to your neighbors. Hope you like feet. And they didn't stop with the walls. Icelanders stuffed moss into any possible crevice, used sod to cover exposed beams, and layered the roof with overlapping turf slabs, thick enough to support a full-grown sheep doing a little roof dance. In winter, snow would pile on top, adding insulation rather than taking it away. Historians still argue whether snow loading was intentional design or just a lucky accident, but it worked. Sometimes, people built turf homes into hillsides or half-sunk them into the earth for added protection, literally living in the ground like frost-resistant gophers. These semi-subterranean homes stayed relatively temperate, especially when reinforced with wool-lined walls or sealskin curtains to trap heat. Doorways were built with sharp corners or extended tunnels to act as windbreaks. Think of it like the medieval Icelandic version of a mudroom, except the mud was the house. And yet, despite all this smart engineering, moisture was always a problem. The turf would sweat in the spring and leak in the rain. Mold? Oh, it was basically a roommate. Some families used dried animal dung to patch leaks or stuff between turf bricks for extra warmth. Not exactly a candle scent you'll find at the store, but effective. A few even claim the dung helped repel spirits, though historians still debate whether that's based in belief or just common sense. Who wants to haunt a place that smells like cow pie? It wasn't all miserable, though. Some turf homes were downright charming by medieval standards. If you were lucky or rich, you might have wooden panels along the walls or decorative carvings over the doorframe. A few households kept painted icons or talismans above the hearth to invite warmth, luck, and less mold. And in the summer months, flowers sometimes bloomed from the rooftops. Imagine lying in bed and hearing bees buzzing directly above you in your ceiling. It's a little magical. If you forget about the mildew, you peek outside the turf house now and see just how well it blends into the frozen landscape. No wonder Icelanders didn't worry much about invasions. Who's going to raid a village they can't even find under all the moss and snow? Some historians suggest these naturalistic designs weren't just practical, they were cultural. A way of harmonizing with nature, rather than dominating it. Then again, others argue it was purely functional. No trees, no stone. No choice, turf or bust. You glance back inside and notice another detail. Near the door is a small shelf lined with stones, not decoration, but thermal mass. During the day, when the fire burns high, these stones absorb heat. At night, they radiate it back, like little ancient space heaters. It's subtle, but it helps. And if you sleep near them, wrapped in your sheepskin cocoon, it might be the difference between waking with numb toes or just mildly annoyed ones. And here's something you wouldn't expect. When these turf houses fell out of use and were abandoned, they didn't rot. They returned to the earth. After a few seasons, they were covered in moss again, then grass, then flowers, until the entire thing vanished. It's as if the island itself gently reabsorbed its borrowed architecture. One minute it's a house, next minute it's a hill. Historians still marvel at how sustainable this design truly was, even if it wasn't exactly luxurious. You run your hand along the inside wall again, the moss cool and slightly damp under your fingers. Outside, the wind roars, snow swirls, and the landscape disappears into white. But inside this low, huddled turf shell, you're wrapped in ancient strategy, born of scarcity and survival, shaped by centuries of stubborn resilience. And you're beginning to understand something. Warmth wasn't a given here, it was an achievement. You shift your weight on the hard sleeping platform, your knees cracking in protest, and stretch your legs under the shared blanket of sheepskin and woven wool. The warmth you've built up in the night is stubborn, clinging to your limbs even as the air nips at your nose. Around you, others begin to stir, quiet rustles, soft coughs, someone mumbling in a dream language you'll never understand. And that's when you notice it again. Moss, not just in the walls, not just packed between roof slats, but tucked into boots, lining mittens, and even crammed inside the ears of sleeping goats. Yes, moss was more than a building material. It was medieval Iceland's version of thermal tech. You step cautiously into the small storage alcove, not so much a room as a dark, earthy closet. It smells like old cheese and something slightly fermented. Here, baskets and sacks sit in neat disorder. In one, dried moss is packed tightly, greenish-brown clumps that look like forest lint. You pick some up. It's soft, spongy, oddly warm against your fingers. And this unassuming plant, plucked from lava fields and damp glens, was one of their most valuable tools for staying warm and dry in a place that was rarely either. You probably think of moss as that weird stuff on shady rocks. Maybe you've seen it in fairy tales, growing on ancient trees or damp dungeon walls. But for Icelanders, moss wasn't decorative. It was practical magic. There are over 600 types in Iceland alone, and they harvested it with care, laying it out to dry on flat rocks or hanging it in bundles like herbal laundry. The best varieties were spongy, absorbent, and naturally insulating. They could trap warmth, wick away moisture, and pad the hard edges of daily life. In boots, moss served as both sock and lining. You'd stuff it around your toes and ankles, change it out when it got wet, and replace it daily if you were lucky enough to have a good stash. Think of it like medieval Gore-Tex, but biodegradable. It didn't smell great, but it kept you from freezing your toes off, and that's a win. Moss also padded gloves and mittens, turning stiff wool shells into something almost wearable. Even bedding sometimes got the moss treatment, with dried clumps spread beneath furs for a little extra softness, like nature's version of a memory foam topper. And it wasn't just body insulation. They used moss in their homes too, stuffed between wooden beams, packed into cracks in turf walls, lined around the edges of door frames. It helped muffle the wind, absorb condensation, and kept insects from colonizing the cozier corners of your living space. You'd even find it inside window slits if your house was fancy enough to have one. A draft blocker, pest repellent, and insulation layer, all in one humble plant. But here's where it gets weirder. Some mosses were believed to have magical properties, especially reindeer moss and Iceland moss. Those ghostly pale varieties that look like something from a haunted terrarium. People said they held heat better if harvested during a full moon or lost their power if plucked in anger. Some families swore by moss talismans, small bundles tied with red thread and tucked under bed frames or near doorways to trap cold spirits. Historians still argue whether these charms were pagan leftovers or just very hopeful housekeeping. Either way, the belief ran deep. Moss was alive, and it remembered. You glance at a small bowl near the hearth. Inside, dried moss has been sprinkled with something herbal and is slowly smoking, releasing a rich, grassy scent. Moss incense. It was used to ward off sickness, cleanse the air, and sometimes simply to mask the smell of wet wool and unwashed feet. And while we're on that subject, moss was also used as a kind of medieval tissue or even toilet paper. You wince. But hey, when it's between frozen seaweed and a soft moss clump, you pick the clump. Every time. Out in the pasture beyond the turf walls, people gather moss by hand. No scythes, no rakes, just slow, careful picking so the roots aren't damaged. Because here's the thing, moss grows painfully slow. Like geological time slow. A square meter might take decades to regenerate if over-harvested, which means the moss patches were treated with reverence. Some households even mark the spots they'd return to each season, like moss gardens passed down through generations. Kids were taught early on how to spot the good stuff and warned never to pluck more than needed. Not because it was rare, but because it was sacred. Imagine, for a second, living in a world where moss is a prized possession, where the soft green stuff under your feet is survival, comfort, and maybe even protection from malevolent frost spirits. It makes you look at your surroundings differently. Every hill becomes a source of warmth. Every patch of fuzzy growth, a potential blanket or boot liner. And in that context, moss doesn't just keep you warm, it keeps you connected to the land, the past, the stories whispered during long, dark winters. Of course, not all moss worked equally well. Some varieties grew too brittle, some stayed damp no matter how long you dried them, and some attracted bugs like they were throwing a moss rave. A few unlucky families found that out the hard way. There are stories, half jokes, half warnings, about cursed moss that would make your feet itch or attract spirits into your bedchamber. Whether those tales came from genuine belief or the sheer despair of trying to get comfortable on a wet clump of decomposing flora, no one really knows. But they're still told. Quietly. Especially when the nights get long and the wind presses its face against your windows like a curious ghost. And speaking of ghosts, one fringe Icelandic folktale claims that moss can remember the dead. That if you sleep with a tuft of moss under your pillow, harvested from a place someone loved in life, you'll dream their final thoughts. It's a chilling little whisper of animism that lingers in some of the older texts. Historians still argue whether this was part of a broader pre-Christian belief system or just bedtime threats designed to keep kids from wasting moss. Either way, it makes you think twice before stuffing that pillow. Back in the turf house, you watch a woman preparing travel boots. She rubs the inside with warm fat, maybe seal or whale, then presses moss into every fold. She does it with the care of someone braiding a loved one's hair. You ask if it helps. She smiles and shrugs. Helps more than prayers, she says, and that about sums it up. In a place where the wind never stops and warmth is a memory, moss is the soft, strange line between suffering and surviving. You step outside again, the cold biting instantly at your face. But your boots feel better now. The moss inside holds warmth like a secret. Each step is a little less cruel, a little more bearable. And somehow, in the face of all this frozen silence, it's the softest thing you've ever trusted. You press your shoulder into the creaking door and step back into the warmth, or at least the comparative not cold of the turf house. Your boots are heavy with wet snow, your breath clings to your lips in little frozen clouds, but the moss still cradles your toes, doing its quiet, heroic job. The fire in the center is back to life, flickering steadily in its stone hearth, and someone's added more dung to it, which means things are going to smell distinctly barn-like in here for the next few hours. You settle onto the edge of the sleeping platform and notice someone passing you a bundle wrapped in cloth. When you open it, steam escapes, and the smell of boiled grain and fermented milk hits you like a warm puff of something deeply nutritious. It's time to eat. Because in medieval Iceland, staying warm started from the inside out. They didn't call it caloric intake or macro ratios. They just knew that if you didn't eat enough fat, you'd freeze. And not in a poetic, drifting to sleep kind of way. We're talking limb-stiffening, breath-stopping cold. So food wasn't just fuel, it was insulation. And your diet, surprisingly hearty. Welcome to a world where skyr was breakfast, lunch, dinner, and possibly dessert. Skyr, a thick, tangy, yogurt-like cheese that's still eaten today, was a staple of the Icelandic diet. Made from skimmed milk, it's technically a cheese, but don't expect a wheel or wedge. It's scooped, slurped, or smeared, depending on how fancy you're feeling. Rich in protein, low in fat, and slightly sour, it provided not just nutrition, but a little culinary variety in a landscape where variety was mostly a rumor. People added it to porridge, used it as a base for sauces, or just ate it by the bowlful. And in winter, a pot of skyr kept near the fire stayed just warm enough to eat without shattering your molars. But skyr was just the beginning. You'd also eat rye bread, dense, dark, and cooked underground using geothermal heat in some parts of Iceland. No joke. People would bury dough in tightly wrapped pots near hot springs and come back the next day to find a perfectly baked loaf. Slightly sweet, a little crusty, and warm enough to make you forget your toes were numb. Historians still argue whether this method was born out of convenience or necessity. But hey, if your oven is a bubbling mud pool, you use it. Then there's the meat. Sheep were the MVPs of Icelandic survival, warm, woolly, and delicious. You'd eat every part of them, smoked, dried, or boiled into soups. Nothing went to waste. Heads were singed and roasted, blood was turned into sausage, and fat was rendered and stored like gold. In fact, fat was so valuable that families might pass around a bowl of melted sheep tallow to dip bread in. Like fondue, from a much more desperate timeline. It sounds horrifying, but when the wind howls and your stomach's empty, it's pure velvet. And the real hero of winter warmth? Fermented shark. Hakarl. If you've never heard of it, brace yourself. Greenland shark meat is naturally toxic when fresh, but if you bury it in gravel, press it with stones, let it rot for several weeks, and then hang it to dry for a few more months, you end up with something that smells like ammonia and tastes like commitment. It's not delicious. It's not even tolerable, but it's loaded with protein and was a source of pride. Even today, it's a rite of passage. Back then, it was a sign you were truly from the land, able to eat the worst and keep walking. You watch as a boy dips a lump of dried fish into butter and chews slowly, his expression unreadable. Dried fish, especially cod, was another staple. It didn't go bad, didn't need fire to prepare, and if you gnawed on it long enough, it softened just enough to swallow without sobbing. Sometimes it was soaked in milk or beer to rehydrate, but often people just sucked on it for warmth, like fish jerky with delusions of grandeur. Oddly, it was also traded as currency. A man's wealth might be measured in dried fish slabs stacked in his storehouse like salted gold. And then there were soups and stews. Simple, hearty, and built to stretch a single lamb bone into 3 days' worth of meals. You'd find barley, onions, if available, turnips, and whatever else hadn't frozen into compost. Into the pot it went. The longer it cooked, the better. The richer it became, and the better it coated your insides against the cold. Some families kept a pot simmering for days, adding to it as needed, a medieval slow cooker that never truly emptied. The flavor depends on who you ask. Some claimed it tasted like comfort. Others said it tasted like surrender. But either way, it warmed your belly. Even drinks were weaponized against winter. Hot milk, beer warmed by the fire, thin broths flavored with scraps of meat or seaweed, all designed to keep your core temperature from falling through the floor. One fringe practice even included sipping warm seawater mixed with herbs, believed to align the inner winds. Historians still argue whether this was legitimate medicine or just a deeply questionable dare. But hey, when snow blocks your door and the wind sounds like it's screaming your name, you'll try anything. And here's where things get magical again. Some foods weren't just fuel, they were believed to carry warmth as a spiritual property. Certain stews were stirred only clockwise to invite good fortune. Bread might be marked with symbols before baking to trap the fire inside. A chunk of fat from a particularly robust sheep might be hidden in the walls for luck. Scholars still debate whether this mingling of food and superstition was pagan tradition or early Christian syncretism. But when the night is long and you're hungry, you don't question the recipe, you just eat and hope. There's a saying whispered over shared meals: hot food, warm hands, calm heart. And as you sit there, sipping a weak barley broth with a lump of mystery meat sinking to the bottom, it makes sense. In this place, food wasn't just nourishment, it was armor. A spoonful of heat in a bowl of cold months. A reminder that you were still here, still alive, still chewing, and that was enough. Later that night, someone hands you a wooden bowl. Inside is warm, milk thickened slightly with a dash of honey and moss ash. Yes, moss ash, a concoction believed to bring dreams of spring and protection from the cold's grip. You sip slowly. It tastes like smoke, memory, and something unnamably old. And just like that, your bones ache a little less. Your shoulders drop a little closer to sleep. Warmth begins again from the inside out. You wake to the soft clink of wooden bowls being stacked, the scrape of a ladle across the bottom of a pot, and the low hum of a morning hymn filtering in from the corner. It's still dark, because of course it is. The sun barely peeks over the horizon during this part of the year, and when it does, it feels more like a rumor than a celestial event. You rise slowly, limbs stiff from the chill that settled in the night. You're not alone. Others stir too, yawning, stretching, wrapping themselves tighter in cloaks that still smell faintly of smoke and sheep. Someone offers you a steaming sip of leftover broth, and you take it. The warmth slides down your throat and sits in your chest like a small, kind weight. But now it's time to move. Because in medieval Iceland, staying warm didn't mean staying still. It meant working your body like a bellows, stoking heat from within through the sacred, exhausting magic of labor. You step outside into a white-gray blur of snow and mist. The wind tugs at your hair, bites at your cheeks, instantly turning your skin into brittle parchment. But your breath curls out in long, visible ribbons, and soon your body begins the work of warming itself. In this land, your blood is your only central heating system, and it takes effort to keep it circulating. So whether it's fetching water, cutting ice blocks, tending to animals, or gathering fire fuel, there's always something to do. Something that demands motion, and therefore creates warmth. First, it's the sheep. Woolly, wide-eyed, and half-frozen like everything else, they still need feeding, brushing, and occasionally rescuing from snowdrifts. You lift a bale of dried grass and carry it to the pen. Each movement sends sparks of heat into your arms and legs. The sheep crowd around, grateful and insistent, their breath rising in little huffs of steam. One nudges your side like a cold pillow, and you mutter something unprintable. It's the kind of affection that means, "I won't eat you today." Probably, Inside the barn, things are marginally warmer thanks to body heat and the tightly packed walls. It's pungent in a way that defies polite description, like wet wool, manure, and something ancient trying to make a comeback. But here, you can shed a layer without risking frostbite, and the work keeps your muscles humming. You brush a goat, untangle hay from its hooves, and mutter nonsense into its ear. There's something oddly meditative about it. The repetition, the weight of the task, the steadiness of warm blood moving beneath fur and skin. Then comes wood. Except, surprise, trees are basically a luxury. Iceland's forests were already scarce by the medieval era, and chopping down what little you had was seen as a last resort. Instead, you gathered driftwood gifted by the sea, gnawed smooth by salt and waves, or hack apart old structures, fallen turf, or dried animal bones. Yes, bones burn. Not well, not long, and not pleasantly, but they do the job. So does dried seaweed, and of course, animal dung, pressed into patties and stacked like fire bricks. You stack these carefully near the hearth, already feeling the faint sting of blisters forming along your palms. But that sting is heat, and heat is survival. Movement is everything here. Even spinning wool or weaving cloth is a kinetic dance. Women sit near the fire, their hands in constant motion. The rhythmic pull of a spindle, the gentle thud of a loom, each motion another layer of warmth added to the house, to the clothing, to the day. Children run errands or chase chickens, their squeals slicing the air like small, joyful knives. Every laugh, every footstep, every flung snowball is a rebellion against the cold's creeping fingers. But even leisure time, when it appears, isn't idle. Sitting still too long is dangerous, so people knit, carve, sew, mend nets, or tell stories, often while pacing slowly or rocking back and forth, coaxing heat through movement. Some even practiced a kind of manual isometric exercise, tightening and releasing muscles while seated to keep the blood from settling like a lazy river headed toward frostbite. Historians still argue whether this was ritualized training or just clever desperation. Either way, it worked. And of course, there's singing. Not just for the soul, but for the lungs. Long, droning chants and lilting work songs that kept rhythm, boosted morale, and warmed the chest from the inside out. You join in hesitantly, your voice cracking at first, but soon you find the pitch and the breath, and the vibration fills your ribs like a low, glowing coal. Music was more than comfort. It was a kind of thermal defiance. You can't sing if your blood's frozen. In some households, warmth was built communally. People gathered tightly, worked in synchronized rhythms, and even coordinated breathing during deep, cold spells. A fringe practice called hivvith involved synchronized exhalation around the hearth, believed to concentrate heat and breathe fire into the space. It sounds strange, almost mystical, but try huddling with 5 people in a small room and breathing deeply in unison, and you might feel it. Historians still argue whether this was ritual or just really committed cuddling. Either way, it speaks to how seriously they took body-generated heat. By mid-afternoon, not that you can tell by the light, because it's still dim as a candle stub, you've hauled, brushed, chopped, and repaired enough to feel sweat trickling down your spine. It's almost a betrayal, the idea of sweating in a place like this. Because sweat is a double-edged icicle. Once you stop moving, your damp clothes become enemies, freezing against your skin and sucking out every ounce of warmth they helped create. So you change quickly, peeling off layers, letting them steam near the fire, replacing them with dry, moss-lined, and mildly less damp clothing. You've earned this heat. You've made it with your own 2 hands. There's something holy about exhaustion here. About the ache in your limbs, the throb in your fingers, the sting in your cheeks. These sensations mean you did something. You resisted the cold and won, if only for the day. You feel it in your feet as you shift them closer to the fire. In your arms as you lift a mug of warm Skyr milk to your lips. In your back as you lean into a corner padded with sheep fleece and turf. It's not comfort, but it's close. It's earned. And then there are the silent rituals. The ones nobody names out loud. Like standing just so near the hearth, rotating in slow increments to toast every part of your body equally. Or sitting with your knees tucked under your chin, arms wrapped tight, becoming your own blanket. Or turning your boots upside down on sticks overnight so the warmth doesn't escape back into the floor. Tiny gestures that keep the cold at bay. Soft magic built from routine and desperation. Later, as darkness claims the sky once again, you didn't even notice when it left. You settle into sleep with muscles sore, stomach full, and body humming with the kind of warmth you can't fake. You feel every ache like a victory. You earned this night. You built it from work, sweat, and stubbornness. And in the bone-deep quiet that follows, you finally understand. In medieval Iceland, the fire didn't keep you warm. You kept you warm. You drift in and out of dreams as the wind carves new lullabies along the edges of the turf walls. It howls and sighs, never quite sleeping, never quite still, like an old god with a long memory and cold hands. When you stir again, it's because someone is shuffling around the sleeping platform, slipping on stiff boots, whispering not very quiet instructions to get ready. The morning routine is less of a routine and more of a low-level emergency, again. Because even with yesterday's work, the fire has sagged into embers, the air is sharp, and the world outside remains locked in its frozen snarl. Time to make the rounds again. But today, something's different. Today, someone mentions moss, not the soft bedding you've come to appreciate, but moss as a kind of secret. A story. A material filled with peculiar power, warmth, and maybe, just maybe, a dash of quiet enchantment. You step outside again, this time more aware. You scan the landscape not just for wood or snowdrifts, but for green, or rather, what passes for green in a world bleached by ice and steam. Moss in medieval Iceland wasn't just ground cover. It was a solution, a healer, a symbol. It crept between stones and softened the edges of survival. Lichen and moss grew slow, quietly patient, and humans began to notice that wherever moss thrived, life could too. You crouch near a patch, brushing away a layer of frost, and there it is, soft, springy, impossibly alive against all odds. Back inside, the elders talk of moss with an almost suspicious reverence. Not because it's rare, quite the opposite, but because it's essential. They use it for bedding, yes, and you've already slept on its springy comfort. But that's just the beginning. Moss was used in clothes, stuffed between wool layers like natural insulation. It was tucked into boots, sewn into tunics, and packed into mittens. It held warmth better than dry grass and didn't rot as quickly. A good clump of moss could mean the difference between frostbite and just being really, really cold. And it had more uses still. People used moss for bandages, especially the kind called Iceland moss, which, fun twist, isn't a moss at all, but a lichen. It looks like flaky green-gray coral and grows in mats across volcanic rock, as if the land itself is slowly trying to knit a sweater. When boiled into a tea, it was said to heal coughs and soothe the stomach. When dried and crushed, it was packed into wounds. And when you really needed it, you could eat it, sort of. It was bitter and required lots of rinsing to remove its natural toxins, but in desperate times, moss porridge was a thing. Not a good thing, but a thing. Historians still argue whether this reliance on moss was a stroke of brilliance or evidence of desperation. Either way, it worked, and it shaped the Icelandic relationship with the land. You weren't just surviving on the land, you were surviving with it, using every tiny gift it offered, even if it was barely more than a damp sponge stuck to a rock. There's a story someone tells around the hearth tonight. It's about a girl who wove moss into the lining of her dress and could walk through the snow without shivering. Some said it was because she had a good wool base layer. Others said she had moss blessed by the hidden folk. The Hulju folk, those elusive, magical beings that lived in rocks and hills and didn't much care for noisy neighbors. Some believed the moss grew where they walked. Others swore that leaving a tiny offering near moss beds, milk, bread, even a pretty stone, would ensure good luck and warm hands for the season. You look at the moss in your boots a little differently now. And the firewood shortage, moss helped there too. Dried moss was burned as a last resort, especially sphagnum moss, which caught flame quickly when dry and gave off a surprising amount of heat for something that looked like wet lint. You'd need a lot of it, like a lot. But in the absence of driftwood or dung, it could be the spark that kept the fire alive just long enough to boil water or toast your last chunk of dried bread. Even today, some Icelanders talk about childhoods where moss fires were the only thing keeping the kettle going during brutal storms. But the role of moss didn't stop at the hearth. It was sometimes used in building insulation, pressed between turf bricks or packed into wall cracks to block the wind. You feel along the inside of the turf house wall and notice it now, rough patches, dry and fibrous, wedged into seams like mortar. It's not elegant, but it's effective. The same moss that cradles your head at night also guards your home from the teeth of the storm. It's everywhere, and you begin to realize it's not just a material. It's a companion. There's even a kind of low-grade mythology attached to it. Some believed moss held memories, that if you slept with your head on a certain moss patch, you might dream someone else's dreams. Others said moss never grew where lies were told. One particularly spooky tale tells of a woman who gathered moss from a certain cursed stone hill and used it in her child's bedding. That child, the story goes, never felt cold, but also never spoke again. You don't know what to do with that one, but you do fluff your moss pillow with a little more hesitation tonight. You're starting to see how warmth here wasn't just a question of degrees. It was a matter of rituals, resources, and deeply held beliefs. Staying warm wasn't only physical, it was psychological, even spiritual. Moss wasn't just stuffing. It was a talisman. A reminder that nature, though often cruel, could still be generous in quiet, green, squishy ways. And so people learned to speak its language, to harvest it gently, to dry it carefully, to thank it sometimes aloud. Not because they were quaint or superstitious, but because when everything else wants to kill you, gratitude becomes a survival instinct too. Later that evening, someone hands you a moss-wrapped bundle. Inside is a stone, still warm from the fire, wrapped in layers of cloth and moss. You press it to your chest as you lie back onto the sleeping platform. The warmth seeps into your ribs, your spine, your bones. You breathe in deeply and catch the faint, earthy scent of moss, half forest, half ash, all comfort. And as your eyes close, you realize the cold is still out there, still clawing at the edges of the world. But tonight, you are wrapped in something older than fire, older than memory. And for now, that is enough. The fire flickers low, casting sleepy shadows across the turf walls as a gentle hush settles over the longhouse. But sleep doesn't come right away, not because you're restless, but because someone has begun telling another story, this time in a voice so low and even it might as well be a spell. You settle into the moss-lined bedding, warmed by the stone tucked under your cloak, and listen. It's a story about the wind and about the people who tried to trap it, not with rope or net or brute force, but with words, symbols, and a little something called Galdrestafir. This, it turns out, is where the magic part of staying warm really kicks in. You've heard the word before, in passing, Galdrestafir, Icelandic magical staves. Strange symbols that look like snowflakes crossed with riddles. These were more than doodles scratched in idle moments. They were spells compressed into ink and bone and charcoal. Protective, persuasive, even petty at times. Some were meant to guide sailors, others to defeat enemies or win lovers. But many were designed to preserve life against the cold. You learn this now, as an elder unfolds a piece of aged calfskin parchment, revealing a series of lines so sharp and symmetrical they almost hum with meaning. There's one symbol, etched in the dirt by a finger trembling with age or reverence or both. It's said to hold heat, a stave meant to keep the body warm even when the fire dies, even when the wind bites through walls and reason. You're told it must be drawn near the chest, under the shirt, and redrawn each day before sunrise. The ink, traditionally, it was made from a mix of ash, moss, and blood, though you're not required to get quite that authentic tonight. Still, just hearing this makes you warmer somehow. Like the mere belief in the symbol creates a heat of its own. And belief was heat in a place like this. Not just metaphorically, but functionally. People believed that spoken charms, Galder, could keep frost from forming inside boots or keep meat from freezing solid overnight. These weren't spells in the fireball-throwing sense. They were careful whispers, spoken with rhythm and respect, tuned to the same frequency as the land itself. Galder comes from the root meaning to sing or chant, and these chants were often slow, melodic, hypnotic. You imagine people huddled near the hearth, humming old syllables under their breath as they work wool or warm their hands. Maybe that sound, vibrating in the chest, stirring the air, really did help keep them warm. Historians still argue whether these magical practices were genuinely believed or just cultural holdovers, echoes of a pre-Christian past repurposed as cozy traditions. But when you're half frozen and terrified your toes might snap off like candied fruit, you don't get too picky about your sources of warmth. You'll chant to Thor, or Jesus, or the kitchen stool if it gets the job done. One woman speaks of a practice where magical symbols were carved into whale bone and then worn around the neck like talismans. The warmth wasn't just from the symbol, she says, but from the bone itself, kept near the heart, absorbing body heat, returning it gently like a memory. There's something poetic about that. Magic as a thermal feedback loop. You begin to suspect these people were less concerned with how warmth arrived than simply ensuring that it did. Another man describes using charms on doorways. Inscribed in ash on the lintel, barely visible unless you know where to look. These were to keep the wind out and the soul in, he explains. A phrase so beautifully simple you decide it's going to be your new winter motto. Sometimes, the staves were burned into wooden beams with hot pokers or carved carefully into soapstone kept near the hearth. Not for aesthetics, not even for faith necessarily, but because these were tools. Like firewood, like moss, like mittens sewn from sheep that probably still give you the stink eye when you feed them. And then there's the more peculiar side of things. A tale floats through the smoke of a woman who embroidered magical runes onto the inside lining of her cloak, using her own hair and the thread from a lamb's first shearing. The warmth, they say, was not just physical, it protected her spirit from becoming frost-hollowed. You don't know what that means exactly, but it sounds like something you'd very much like to avoid. The cloak supposedly never caught snow. The flakes melted before touching it. She was said to walk in blizzards as if strolling through summer grass. Whether that's true or not, you make a mental note to never insult an Icelandic cloak. Later, someone shares a stave used to keep frost from settling in the corners of the house. A simple design, cross-shaped with hooks on each arm. It's scratched into a piece of bone and hung near the roof beam. The logic is as elegant as it is haunting. Draw heat to where cold collects and protect the home from within. Even more haunting is the idea that some people didn't use these symbols for protection at all, but to curse others with cold. To draw chill into someone's bones or ensure their hearth fire sputtered at the worst possible moment. It's hard not to shiver at that thought. The cold isn't just an environmental enemy, it's also a weapon. And magic, it turns out, cuts both ways. There's even an old spell, part lullaby, part incantation. that mothers whispered to their children on the coldest nights. It's rhythmic, almost song-like, and the words tumble over one another like snow on a roof. The spell isn't meant to summon anything dramatic, just warmth, just rest, just a little invisible blanket to wrap around a small, shaking body. You hear someone murmur it now, and for a moment the longhouse feels smaller, closer, held together not just by turf and moss, but by the way people share heat with their voices. You think about your own breath now, fogging up the air just slightly. About how many times today you've made heat without realizing it, through words, motion, even thought. There's a kind of quiet magic in that. No fire needed. Just presence. Just breathe. Just you. Even the act of remembering these staves, of drawing them in your mind, or mimicking their shapes with your fingers in the dark, feels like a ritual in itself. Like a reminder that human beings have always found strange, creative, slightly desperate ways to fight the cold. Before sleep finally pulls you down, someone draws one last stave onto a piece of wood and tucks it near your bedding. You don't recognize the symbol, but you ask what it means. The elder smiles and simply says, "It's to keep the warmth you've made." Not warmth you've borrowed or begged for, but the warmth you've made. That stays with you. That glows even after the fire dies. And as your eyelids lower, as the cold slips just slightly further from your skin, you think maybe that's the most powerful kind of magic there is. The morning light barely scrapes the horizon, more suggestion than sunrise, a soft blue glow that creeps through the turf seams and nudges your eyelids open. You stretch beneath your moss-lined blankets, and for a second you feel it, the lingering trace of the stave drawn the night before, as if some tiny warmth chose to stay curled up beside you. Outside, the cold waits, but so does something else. A task, a ritual. Today, you're going to learn how Icelanders layered their way to survival. Not just in clothing, but in mindset, materials, and a kind of wearable strategy for dodging death by frostbite. It's time to get dressed, or rather, get armored against the elements. First things first, you don't just throw on a wool tunic and call it a day. No. Getting dressed in medieval Iceland is a choreographed routine, equal parts logic and superstition. You start with the innermost layer, linen, if you're lucky enough to have it, or soft wool if not. Linen is cool against the skin but dries faster than wool and feels less like wrapping yourself in an itchy goat. Problem is, linen doesn't grow on volcanic plains, so any such cloth is either passed down like treasure or traded with someone who knows someone who just sailed in from Norway. If you do have it, you guard it like a dragon guards its hoard. Over the base layer comes the real hero of Icelandic survival. Wool. Sheep in Iceland aren't just animals, they're lifelines. Hardy, self-sufficient, and somehow both adorable and vaguely judgmental, these sheep produce wool with two distinct layers, the long, coarse outer fibers known as tog, and the soft, insulating underlayer called thell, pronounced something like thell with a thistle in your throat. The combination makes for a textile that laughs in the face of snowstorms. You don your kiatil, a tunic of thick wool, and already feel a difference, like slipping inside a house made of felted fire. Then come the trousers, wool again naturally. They're scratchy but effective, the kind of garment that turns your legs into sausage links wrapped in comfort. On your feet, thick socks made of woven lopi, the unspun Icelandic wool that's as fluffy as it is insulating. If you're especially lucky, or just particularly cold, you might stuff some moss or hay inside your shoes for extra padding. Boots are made from sheep or fish skin, often softened with seal oil and stitched by hands that understand cold better than any thermometer ever could. You tie them tight, using sinew or braided wool cords, and hope they hold. If they don't, well, your toes probably won't either. Over everything, you drape a felder, a heavy cloak, ideally made from sheepskin or another dense material. It hangs heavy on your shoulders, but it also blocks wind like a charm. Some felders have hoods, others don't. Some are lined with fur, others are reversible, with one warm side and one wind-breaking side, flipped depending on the direction of the blizzard. And you fasten it not with buttons, but with a brooch or pin, often iron or bronze, sometimes bone, and occasionally etched with protective runes to guard you not just from cold, but from bad luck and bad attitudes. Historians still argue whether Icelanders layered this way as a response to their unique climate or simply adapted Scandinavian traditions. What's certain is that their cold weather gear wasn't just about warmth, it was about adjustability. Because Icelandic weather isn't just cold, it's moody, temperamental. A blizzard one minute, a thaw the next, then sideways ice rain just because it can. So people learn to dress like onions with a temper, layer upon layer, ready to peel back or double up depending on what the sky decided to do that hour. You might think this all sounds bulky. And yes, it is. There's nothing sleek or aerodynamic about traditional Icelandic winter wear. But you know what is sleek? Survival. Looking fashionable was a luxury reserved for spring. In winter, the only accessory that mattered was body heat, and keeping it trapped long enough to avoid turning into a sad little wool-wrapped icicle. But the layering strategy wasn't just for clothes. People layered everything. Straw inside bedding, moss inside mittens, sheep dung under turf, and salt in dried fish to keep it edible longer. Even houses were layered, turf over stones over driftwood over bones. Every layer was an extra step between you and the cold. It wasn't about perfection. It was about accumulation. Layered life, layered love, layered prayers muttered under breath while you wrapped another scarf around your neck. And scarves, yes, those mattered too, though they weren't quite the hand-knitted gifts from grandma you might imagine. More like lengths of felted wool, often tucked beneath cloaks or used to tie hoods close around the chin. Sometimes, people smeared animal fat on exposed skin, especially cheeks and noses, to block the wind and preserve what little moisture the cold hadn't already claimed. You try not to picture yourself as a walking butter sculpture, but hey, whatever works. There's a common superstition that floats through these conversations, something about not putting on your left shoe before your right. They say it invites imbalance, which is just another way of saying bad luck. Others believe that clothing must never be mended after sundown or else the warmth sewn into it will leak out into the night. You don't know if that's true, but you do notice that people tend to sew by daylight, their fingers moving with a rhythm that suggests both necessity and something like reverence. Every stitch is a little prayer, a little rebellion against the freeze. Later, someone shows you a mitten design used for children. It's double-walled, with dried moss sandwiched between layers of wool and tied at the wrist with a loop of gut cord so they don't fall off during play, or blizzards, or mysterious vanishings into the snowdrifts, which, based on the side-eye people give the hidden folk, apparently happens more than you'd like. Adults, too, wear mittens often strung together through the sleeves so they don't get lost. The idea of mitten loss as a legitimate life-threatening event really hammers home how much clothing here isn't about aesthetics. It's armor, a mobile shelter, a daily battle plan, and as you stand in your full medieval Icelandic ensemble, cloaked, moss-padded, rune-pinned, and somewhat sausage-shaped, you realize something. Warmth here isn't just about fire or fabric, it's a philosophy, an understanding that survival is stitched together, one layer at a time. From skin to wool to moss to charm to flame, and that the real victory isn't just staying warm, it's doing it together. Sharing mittens, trading felt, whispering tricks about windproofing your hood. It's communal, intimate, weirdly beautiful. The cold, for all its violence, has given these people something precious, a reason to wrap each other in care. And as you walk outside, wrapped in more layers than a secret, you feel it. The air may be sharp, the wind may hiss, but under all of it, next to your skin, you are carrying a centuries-old plan for survival. And it works. You move slowly through the morning chill, your breath a foggy whisper against the thick air, and even though you're layered tighter than a cabbage in crisis, the cold still finds ways to lick at your cheeks and creep through your seams. But it's not just warmth you're bundled in, it's knowledge, borrowed from generations who learned that fire doesn't begin with flames. It begins with the hunt for them. Today, you're headed toward the heart of heat, the fire pit, the hearth, the glowing belly of the home, and more importantly, how Icelanders of the past lit their fires in a world without matches, lighters, or even the luxury of dry kindling on demand. First, you need something to burn. And here's the medieval Icelandic plot twist. Trees are a bit of a rare commodity. Blame it on glacial erosion, overgrazing, volcanic soil, or just centuries of chopping. Whatever the cause, Icelanders didn't exactly have forests of firewood at their disposal. Driftwood? Sure. If the gods, or at least the currents, were feeling generous, you might find a few hunks of Siberian pine or Norwegian spruce washed up on the black sand shores, gnarled and salt-kissed, dragged home like treasure. But day to day, most of your heat came from far humbler stuff. Peat. Glorious, humble peat. Cut from marshy lands and left to dry for months, peat becomes a dense, smoky fuel that burns slowly and evenly. You heft a brick of it and it smells faintly of earth and time, like the graveyard of forgotten plants. It's not the most glamorous flame, and it certainly doesn't smell like cinnamon candles, but it works. And in a land where fire is survival, working is a sacred virtue. Families stack peat in tall, tidy piles outside their turf homes, often covering it with hide to keep off rain and snow. It's not just about staying warm, it's about planning 6 months ahead. Because if you run out in February, you're not just cold. You're done. But before you burn anything, you need a spark. And here's where things get beautifully weird. You sit beside a weathered stone slab inside a longhouse, and someone hands you a small, blunt knife, not for defense, but for striking. This is your fire steel, and in your other hand is a chunk of flint or maybe quartz, if that's what you've scavenged from a nearby hill. You strike the steel against the rock, again and again, until the tiny explosion of orange embers dances from the clash. They're brief, like fireflies with commitment issues, but one of them lands true, right onto your tinder. And no, not that tinder. This one is a fluffy, dry substance ready to catch a spark and cradle it until it grows. In Iceland, the most common tinder was fungus, specifically amadou, scraped from the hoof fungus that grows on birch trees. When properly prepared, which involves drying, boiling, and sometimes soaking it in urine, because why wouldn't that be involved? It becomes astonishingly flammable. You gently blow on the smoldering scrap, fanning the ember until it sighs into flame, then tuck it into a small nest of moss, dry grass, and shaved wood, if you're lucky enough to have it. The fire leaps up, ravenous and bright, and suddenly the room is warmer, louder, more alive. Historians still argue whether these ignition methods were influenced more by Celtic monks or Norse sailors, both of whom had traditions for traveling with their own fire kits. But one thing is certain, fire was never taken for granted. It was coaxed, courted, even bribed. In some households, they whispered blessings over the hearth every morning, or thanked the flames before snuffing them at night. Because to lose your fire was to lose your soul's central heartbeat. And in Icelandic winter, that could become a very literal loss. Some families kept embers alive for days or even weeks in earthen containers, tucked deep in ash to prevent accidental burnouts. These were called eldhúsaskjðu, fire bags or fireboxes, mini hearths on the go. The idea of carrying fire across distance like it was a child makes you pause. You picture a traveler trekking across snow fields, wind howling in their ears, one hand clenched protectively around a warm, smoking pouch slung close to the chest. It's not just practical, it's poetic, like carrying the sun in your coat pocket. Once the fire's roaring, everything begins to feel a little more human again. You notice how people naturally drift toward it, arranging themselves like sleepy cats in concentric rings of warmth. Children closest, elders behind them, then those who are busy cooking or crafting at the perimeter, juggling the warmth with duty. The hearth isn't just a heat source, it's a social hub. The medieval Icelandic version of a group chat. Here's where news is traded, socks are darned, arguments flare, and lullabies begin. Above the flames, an iron hook suspends a blackened pot. It bubbles faintly with the scent of fish and herbs, maybe even a splash of sour whey or preserved cabbage if someone's feeling fancy. You realize that the fire isn't just for warmth. It's the kitchen, the forge, the light source, and occasionally the spiritual stage. Some families place small objects in the hearth, bones, stones, or carved tokens, as offerings to land spirits or ancestors, hoping for protection, good harvests, or maybe just a slightly less miserable Tuesday. Then there are the fire charms. You're handed a sliver of bone etched with looping runes, told to toss it into the flames with a wish whispered low and private. The crackle that follows might just be physics, or maybe the flame listened. Maybe it winked. Not all heat, though, came from flames. Some clever Icelanders relied on radiant stones, heated by fire, then wrapped in cloth and placed into beds to slowly release their warmth over hours. Like a medieval hot water bottle, only less cuddly and far more volcanic. Others packed moss between bed sheets or used dried dung bricks, not burning, just there to insulate and slow heat loss. You blink, trying to imagine a modern mattress stuffed with cow patties, and yeah, no thanks. But back then, it was ingenuity, not grossness. It was about survival, not aesthetics. Fire had its dangers, too. Thatched homes and turf structures weren't exactly fireproof, and accidental blazes could mean tragedy. So people became masters of control, knowing just how much to feed a fire, how to bank the coals overnight, how to snuff the flames safely without sending smoke curling through the rafters like a signal to the gods that you'd messed up. Entire roles within the home revolved around fire stewardship. It was a job, a trust, and sometimes even a rite of passage. Being allowed to tend the hearth was like being granted access to a sacred engine room. And if the fire ever did go out unexpectedly, you'd better believe there were rituals for reigniting it. Some involved spinning around 3 times counterclockwise before striking the flint. Others demanded silence until the flame took hold, or an old chant muttered in a tongue even your grandmother barely remembered. One particularly strange belief held that if you looked into a fire too long without blinking, the flame would steal a secret from you. You're not sure what that means exactly, but you blink anyway, just in case. As the day ends, and the fire shrinks into its glowing heart, you feel the walls of the turf house holding the heat like a lullaby. It won't last forever. You'll need to feed it again before bed, maybe even once in the night. But for now, the fire has done its job. It's turned a pile of moss and rock into a home, a place with light, with breath, with stories whispered across embers like confessions to a quiet, listening friend. You lean back, letting the warmth lick your toes through your thick socks, and think, this fire, this little managed miracle, isn't just fuel. It's family. It's focus. It's the glowing soul at the center of a life forever perched on the edge of winter. You wake before the sun dares to rise, the turf roof above you still thick with the scent of peat smoke and moss-filtered cold. The coals in the hearth breathe faintly, a dying sigh of yesterday's warmth, and the air is sharp enough to make your nose consider unionizing. But you've got something more important to face this morning than cold toes or frozen breath. Today, you'll learn the art of layering. Because staying warm in medieval Iceland wasn't about brute force or one magic coat. It was about the sacred, often itchy, strategy of dressing like your life depended on it, which, it absolutely did. First things first. Underwear, or more accurately, your base layer, and no, it's not sleek athletic gear or moisture-wicking synthetics. It's wool. Soft if you're lucky, scratchy if you're normal, and always a bit musky. You slip into your closest fitting tunic, spun from homespun wool, possibly undyed and clinging to the faint odor of sheep. Not unpleasant, just deeply honest. The kind of smell that reminds you the fabric was once alive and probably named. This layer hugs the skin, traps heat, and starts the slow battle against the day's cold. Next comes your second layer, another tunic, maybe a bit longer, dyed if you're from a well-off household. Blues, browns, and dull reds, all made from local plants, lichens, or imported matter if someone was feeling particularly fancy that trade season. This layer isn't just about warmth, it's about pride. You notice how people hold themselves differently when they're wearing good dye. A splash of indigo can elevate you socially faster than a well-placed insult at the Elthingi. Now onto the trousers, also wool, and usually tucked into long socks or wrapped tightly at the calf with woven bands. These leg bindings, or VAF, serve two purposes: insulation and movement control. You're basically lashing warmth directly to your shins like a field medic of fashion. And over your tunics, you toss on a heavy cloak. It's thick, lined with fur if you're lucky, and fastened at the shoulder with a brooch, round for women, often oval for men, although that line isn't always hard. Some brooches are practical. Others look like they could start arguments in a museum gift shop. Historians still argue whether cloaks were always worn over the left shoulder, or whether that varied by region or role. Some say warriors preferred the left for ease of drawing a weapon with the right hand. Others think it was just about where the wind hit hardest on a particular fjord. Either way, you fasten your cloak tightly and feel like you've stepped into the past and maybe a little into a fantasy novel. Just don't expect any elves, unless you count the Hulju folk, but we'll save them for later. Your shoes, by the way, are not factory-made miracles of tread and arch support. They're simple leather, often made from fish skin or sheepskin, sewn with a soft sole and no distinct left or right. That's right, you wear whichever fits whichever foot that day. Some folks stuff their shoes with moss or hay for insulation, which also worked as shock absorption, sort of like early insoles except biodegradable and occasionally full of bugs. Socks, wool again. Thick, itchy, perfect. You never really escape the embrace of wool, not in this life. Now, imagine you're heading out for the day. Maybe you're going to tend to sheep, check the fish weir, or barter at a neighbor's stead. The wind slaps at your face like it's trying to teach you a lesson, and your breath crystallizes before you like a tiny ghost of breakfast. You're grateful for your outermost layer, a heavy hood or skotthufa, often trimmed with fur and long enough to wrap around the neck. Some were so long they became makeshift scarves or belts in a pinch. Others had tassels, because even in a land of lava fields and frost, a little flair matters. A surprising number of garments were gender-neutral in design, but personalized through accessories. Women might wear a smocker, a sort of overdress held by those famous oval brooches, with a third layer of aprons or kerchiefs to signal status or function. Men added belts with tools, pouches, even knives. You start to notice how each item carries both purpose and personality. Your clothes are not just layers, they're stories. They tell people who you are, what you can afford, where you're from, and how you endure. And then there's the fringe stuff, the weird little additions. Some folks wore dried mouse pelts inside their boots, claiming it helped with frostbite. Others swore by wrapping their midsections in dried seaweed, which allegedly insulated better than cloth. One account mentions a fisherman who tied strips of seal gut around his thighs for water resistance. You don't know whether to admire or fear this level of commitment. Either way, it's a reminder. Necessity is the true mother of style. Inside the home, these layers came off in stages, usually down to one tunic and maybe leggings if the fire was generous. Clothes were rarely washed, soap was precious and water a pain to haul in winter, but they were aired out, brushed, and mended constantly. Lice were a known nuisance, and while there weren't modern solutions, you could powder your garments with ash, bury them in snow, or, yes, boil them briefly in lye if you wanted to really make a point. Every morning, the dressing ritual felt like donning armor against the cold, and every night, peeling the layers off was a victory in itself. But not all heat was clothing-based. Icelanders loved their sleeping furs. Whole families would huddle together under pelts of seal, reindeer, or bear if they'd managed a trade. You, wedged between two sleepy, snoring bodies, become a human puzzle piece in a bed that's more blanket, fort than mattress. The warmth is shared, redistributed like emotional communism. Even the family dog gets a prime spot if it knows how to look cold enough. Interestingly, medieval laws even touched on clothing. There were rules about who could wear what based on class and occasion. Wearing imported silk, for instance, was a big no-no for your average farmer unless it was a wedding or funeral. And yes, people absolutely did get fined for overdressing. Icelanders might have lived rough, but they still believed in dress codes, especially if you dared show up to the Althingi dressed like a chieftain when you were just the chieftain's goat herder. Bold move. You begin to understand that in this land of extremes, warmth isn't one thing, it's a system. Your clothes aren't just for surviving the weather, they're for surviving the culture. Because being warm isn't enough. You've got to look like you meant to be warm. Like you outwitted the cold, not just outran it. And that kind of mastery, you realize, is woven stitch by stitch, day by day, in homes where everyone knows how to patch a sleeve before it tears and how to read a cloud bank before it freezes. As the day winds down, you peel off your outer layers, one at a time, like unwrapping a very itchy onion. You hang your cloak on a peg, your hood on a beam, and your socks near the hearth, hoping they dry by morning without catching fire or being stolen by the cat. You sink into the shared bed, still wearing your innermost tunic because, let's be honest, nobody's risking hypothermia for nudity. The cold may knock at the door tonight, but it won't find its way in, not through all these layers, and certainly not through all the hands that helped make them. The morning begins with a low groan from the earth, a rumble, almost gentle, like a stomach growling beneath layers of stone and moss. You don't panic, not yet, because in Iceland, the ground often talks before it acts. You rise slowly, listening, sniffing the air for the sharp bite of sulfur. That's the giveaway. The land is restless, but so are you, and today you're stepping into the steam-veiled mystery of geothermal living. Because when you live on top of a volcanic hotspot, the earth becomes your reluctant roommate, your accidental heater, and, on a good day, your private spa. It starts with the steam vents. You wander out into the frostbitten field near your turf house and see the faint, ghostly pillars rising from cracks in the ground. Locals call them H-Farrier, and they're not just for show. You hold your hand near one, the heat rolling up in damp waves, carrying the scent of boiled eggs and dragon breath. A few villagers still believe these vents are the size of underground spirits. Others think it's the Earth's way of reminding you who's really in charge. Either way, you respect it. You don't cover the steam, don't block its path, you build around it. Some homes, especially those near Reykholt or H-Farriger, are lucky enough to sit right above geothermal veins. They use hot springs for washing, bathing, and cooking, though not all at once, because that gets complicated fast. You trek to a nearby bathing pool, one that's been shaped with stones to collect the steaming water in a shallow basin. This is no Roman marble bath, It's lichen-crusted rock, moss, and runoff. But you step in and your bones exhale. It's warm, rich with minerals, and just on the edge of scalding. The kind of warmth that seeps in and makes you forget your toes were frozen half the year. Historians still argue whether medieval Icelanders used these pools primarily for bathing or spiritual cleansing, or if maybe it was just the one place where communal nudity wasn't an invitation for gossip. What we do know is that geothermal pools served as gathering spaces long before spas were trendy. People swapped news, told stories, and let the hot water work its magic on old injuries and new grudges. And yes, you'd sometimes bring a wooden ladle with herbs or seaweed to add to the water, like the world's most personal soup. But the magic of geothermal heat wasn't just outdoors. Some turf homes near active zones used primitive heating systems to pipe warmth directly into the walls or floors. Stones heated by steam would be placed under raised platforms. Your ancestors basically invented radiant floor heating while the rest of Europe was still stuffing straw into boots. In some rare cases, hot spring water was channeled through carved stone troughs to warm bathhouses or bread ovens. It wasn't widespread. It was luck of the lava. But if you lived near one, you were warm-adjacent royalty. You peek into one of these special homes, built low into the earth, with turf piled high and steam curling at the edges of the walls like the house itself is dreaming. Inside, the air is warmer, moister. The hearth might still be burning peat, but the background heat comes from the stones themselves. Clothes dry faster, bread bakes easier, and you don't have to sleep in a huddle like half a Viking litter. You can actually stretch your legs without them turning into historical icicles. Of course, not everyone trusts the geothermal gifts. Some folks claim sleeping near steam vents causes strange dreams, visions of creatures underground whispering. Others say the warmth makes you lazy, that real Icelanders earn their warmth with effort, not convenience. There's always someone ready to accuse you of getting too comfortable. It's like medieval passive aggression, but with lava. Still, most people are willing to risk the dreams for the chance to soak sore muscles or keep their bread from freezing solid overnight. One lesser-known trick is the hot stone wrap. Villagers would heat basalt rocks in the shallow springs and then wrap them in thick wool before placing them in beds, under cloaks, or even in shoes. It's like an ancient version of a hot water bottle, except you don't have to worry about leaks. Just the occasional mild burn if you're overconfident. Some healers even believed different rocks carried different energies, with sulfur-streaked stones used to cure fevers and iron-heavy ones thought to boost strength. Whether or not it worked, it gave people a sense of control in a world where nature usually had the upper hand. There's a poetic irony in all this: cold land, fiery veins. You begin to realize that warmth here isn't just about survival. It's about finding the pulse in the ice. Icelanders didn't just huddle against the cold. They studied it, respected it, and used the Earth's secrets to build something sustainable. They didn't wait for better tools or fancier materials. They partnered with the land in all its moods, soothing it with silence, warming with steam, praying when it shook beneath them. You pass a steaming fissure where someone once built a small hut, just a roof and 3 walls to trap the heat pouring out of the earth. Inside, it's always misty, always damp, but gloriously warm. People would come here to dry out boots, heat broth, or just sit and thaw the edges of their souls. Someone left a carved stick in the ground, runes etched into it. Faint now, protection, maybe, or gratitude, or just a note that says, yes, this is a good place. Back at your own stead, if you don't have a spring or vent, you mimic the geothermal system as best you can. You build your hearth deep and central. You bury warm stones under your bed platform. You seal every drafty corner with moss and wool. And on the coldest nights, when the wind howls like it's jealous of your fire, you dream of those natural springs with a longing that's almost romantic. Because in Iceland, warmth is love, and hot water is the rarest, most precious kind of magic. Not all springs are created equal, of course. Some are too hot, literally boiling with enough force to melt a goat hoof. Others are laced with minerals that turn your hair green or your skin itchy. And a few are haunted, allegedly. Locals avoid them, not because of danger, but because of stories. One spring near Maivatn is said to whisper names if you lean close. Another in the Westfjords sings in a language no one speaks anymore. You decide to believe half of it and keep your distance, just in case. You realize now that living in a land with geothermal power is like sharing a house with a dragon that occasionally helps with laundry. It's generous but unpredictable, useful but wild. And while you may never fully understand it, you do appreciate it. The way it heats your bath, your stones, your bones. The way it rises from the ground without asking for anything in return except a little awe and a lot of caution. Tonight, when you climb into bed and tuck a warm stone beneath your feet, you'll feel it again. That quiet, humming reminder that under all this frost, the earth is awake. Alive. And for reasons beyond comprehension, willing to share its warmth with you. You wake to a hush that's almost too quiet. No wind rattling the turf walls, no rain tapping on the roof. Just the low, woolly shuffle of sheep and the slow creak of wood settling around you like a weary breath. The cold still lingers, of course. It always does. But today you're focused on something a little more wearable. Because in a place where warmth is survival, your clothing isn't just fashion, it's full-body strategy. And if you're living in medieval Iceland, that strategy starts and ends with one miracle material: wool. You shrug on your cloak, thick and scratchy, and marvel, again, at how this stuff manages to keep you warm even when it's soaked through and smells like barnyard ambitions. Sheep's wool is more than just a material here. It's currency, it's comfort, it's the closest thing to a medieval hug you're going to get. The Icelandic sheep that gave you this gift is no ordinary fluffball either. It's a hardy, compact, double-coated creature descended from Viking stock, just like you. And its fleece grows in two layers, the soft fell underneath and the coarse tog on top. You blend the two to spin lopi, the magic yarn that makes weather just a little less terrifying. You pull your hood lower against a gust. The wind is sharp today, even under clear skies, and you notice the neighbor's daughter running errands in a dress you recognize, a hand-me-down patched with different wools like a sleepy quilt. Clothing here isn't just handmade. It's hands-worn, hands-mended, hands-sprayed over. A single tunic might last generations, passed down like a story, embroidered with hidden runes for protection or fertility. And yes, some folks did believe that if you stitched your clothes in silence, the spirits wouldn't steal your warmth. You're not taking any chances. Historians still argue whether medieval Icelanders dyed their clothes often or preferred the raw, earthy shades of the wool itself. You notice most people around you wear grays, browns, muted blacks, colors of lava, ash, stone. Occasionally someone flaunts red or blue, and it feels like seeing a flower in a snowbank. Dyes exist, made from lichen, madder root, and imported woad, but they are expensive, tricky, and sometimes considered vain. Still, a splash of color at a feast or gathering can turn heads and hint at deeper pockets. Your boots, like everyone else's, are made from cured sheepskin or calf hide, turned inside out so the fur keeps your feet warm. You stuff them with moss when your socks are too damp to wear. It's not glamorous, but it works. And if you're lucky enough to have mittens, they're usually knitted thick with raw wool, sometimes dipped in lanolin to make them water-resistant. Fingerless designs are common. You need to churn butter, after all, or pluck a lute string if you're feeling poetic. One fringe practice you've seen among the more desperate or creatively inclined is wrapping seaweed into garments. The logic: seaweed holds moisture, but also insulates when dried and layered between fabrics. It's not fashionable, but it gets you through a storm. Some even claim it wards off frostbite if you chant while you wrap it, though that might just be the cold talking. You haven't tried it yet, but you have tucked dried seaweed into your boots more than once. Smells like low tide, but your toes thank you. Then there are the fur trimmings. These aren't just for decoration. They're status symbols, sure, but they also help keep heat from escaping the cuffs, collars, and hoods of your outerwear. Arctic fox, seal, even the occasional bear fur if someone got very lucky or very foolish. The law, oddly specific, regulates who can wear what kind of fur. Wear something too fine for your social rank, and someone might accuse you of pretending to be more than you are, or worse, witchcraft. Clothes here aren't just for comfort. They're political statements woven in sheep's disguise. Inside the longhouse, you hang your cloak carefully. You're not tossing it aside like a coat on a chair. No, every piece of clothing is treated like a sacred tool. Because if your cloak freezes stiff or your socks rot, you're not just inconvenienced, you're endangered. The average medieval Icelander didn't own a closet full of options. Maybe 2 tunics if you're lucky, 1 pair of trousers, and a shawl that doubles as a baby wrap, food bundle, and privacy curtain. Multi-purpose clothing is the name of the game. Layers are life. On long winter nights, you and your household gather by the hearth to mend socks and reknit sleeves. Children learn to card wool before they learn to read. Spindles spin lazily in quiet hands. Someone tells a story, probably about someone freezing to death because they ignored their grandmother's advice about double-layered socks. You all nod solemnly. It's not just bedtime gossip. It's textile wisdom passed down through generations who knew that holes in fabric could become holes in fate. There's one eccentric fellow in your region who insists on wearing seal gut sewn into waterproof trousers. You try not to judge. The man smells like a wet tent, but his legs stay dry even in the worst sleet. You once saw him leap across an icy stream while everyone else huddled under cloaks and muttered curses about fashion versus function. You think he's on to something. You might even ask him for a pair, if you can hold your breath long enough to survive the fitting. Not all warmth comes from the outside, though. You've heard of people sewing tiny pouches of herbs, juniper, angelica, yarrow, into their underclothes for both scent and heat. The belief is that the herbs warm your blood or ward off chills carried by malicious spirits. Some even use dried fish skin, smoothed and shaped like an extra layer between shirt and tunic. You're not entirely sure if this works, but you are sure it smells like ambition. Every year, as the cold creeps in earlier and leaves later, you add one more patch to your cloak, one more seam in your socks. Your garments start to look like a family tree stitched in wool and willpower, and every piece tells a story. This sleeve, torn on a jagged rock during a sheep rescue. That elbow, singed near the hearth while you leaned in too close during a ghost story. You're not just wearing warmth, you're wearing your life. You stand near the door and feel the wind testing the seams of your tunic. But you hold steady, because you've layered well today. Wool against skin, wool over linen, a waterproof outer layer stitched with sinew and prayer. You've walked through storms that tried to peel the color off the sky, and you came out steaming, not shivering. That's no accident. That's medieval Icelandic tailoring at its finest. And tonight, when you fold your cloak at the foot of your bedding platform and slip under layers of woolen blankets, some scratchy, some worn soft from years of use, you'll feel it again. That warmth earned by hands and heard, by mending and making, by wrapping yourself in the ingenuity of a people who refuse to freeze quietly. Your eyes adjust to the dusk outside as you step beyond the turf walls, and already the cold feels sharper against your cheeks, like a knife someone forgot to warm up before using. But your cloak is thick, your boots snug, and as you trudge down the icy path toward the shoreline, you start to notice something strange. This biting wind doesn't stop everyone. A few souls, stragglers, fishermen, farmers, walk around with little flickers of warmth tucked under their arms or strung around their necks or hidden inside tiny leather pouches. You realize gradually that you're not just looking at survival gear. You're looking at charms. In medieval Iceland, magic is stitched into the seams of daily life almost as often as moss is stuffed into boots. When it comes to staying warm, people don't only rely on wool and fire. They lean into runes, amulets, incantations, and the kind of supernatural optimism that probably wouldn't hold up under a microscope, but somehow works in the biting wind of January. And tonight, you're curious enough and cold enough to follow that thread. You meet an older woman by the shore, wrapping seaweed around fish baskets with slow, practiced hands. Around her wrist, a string of carved bone pieces clicks softly together, like teeth whispering secrets. She sees your curious glance and chuckles, says these bones are carved with Galdra staffir or magic staves, and this one here keeps the heat from leaking out of her bones when the frost comes early. You peer closer and recognize one of the more well-known symbols, a rani, meant to bring prosperity and warmth. Another charm shaped like an asterisk with curled ends is supposedly designed to keep fire burning longer. She says the staves only work if you believe in them, or if your grandmother did, which, frankly, might be enough. Historians still argue whether these magical staves were widespread or limited to specific regions and manuscripts. Some claim they were drawn with soot and ash on the walls of turf homes, then wiped away before sunrise to activate their warmth. Others say they were kept secret, hidden in gloves, etched onto spoons, scratched into firewood, to keep embers from dying out overnight. You've even heard of families who embroidered runes into blankets, convinced it would warm the dreams of anyone sleeping underneath. One of the more bizarre, and slightly adorable, fringe practices is the hearth whisper. Supposedly, if you whispered a family member's name into the flames every night before sleep, the fire would remember to stay warm until morning. It's unclear whether this counts as magic or superstition, or just a sleepy form of passive-aggressive love. But you've tried it once or twice. Jury's still out. The fire seemed warmer, but maybe that was just the extra log you tossed on while whispering. Either way, the ritual gives you a strange comfort. You pass a group of children huddled near the church wall, whispering chants you vaguely remember from your own childhood. They're reciting verses taught by an old midwife who once claimed certain rhymes could warm your lungs from the inside. One kid wears a pendant shaped like a sunburst. He says his mother carved it from driftwood and rubbed it with beeswax mixed with dried nettle to keep the winter cough away. You nod solemnly, not daring to poke fun. Because while these charms and talismans might not always work, dismissing them feels like daring the cold to try harder. You enter a neighbor's longhouse and notice a small, soot-darkened board hanging above the hearth. Scratched into the wood are rows of runes, not just the usual letters, but symbols from the old ways. One looks like a three-pronged claw, said to summon internal warmth. Another resembles a spiraled eye. Some say it's for focus. Others say it wards off the freezing stare of spirits in the snowstorms. You stare at it a little too long and swear it pulses when the fire crackles. Probably your imagination. Probably. There's a story, half forgotten but occasionally told with relish, of a man who wore a shirt embroidered with a charm so potent it kept his body warm in a snowstorm that buried 3 farms. He was found wandering, hatless and barefoot, smiling like it was summer. Some say he was blessed. Others say the warmth came at a price. He later lost all his hair and insisted he could still hear fire talking to him. You're not sure if that's a cautionary tale or just Icelandic humor. Either way, you wonder if you'd take the trade. Out on the moor, far from the comfort of hearths and cloaks, you visit a shepherd who keeps watch through the night. His tent is barely more than a stitched seal-hide flap and some driftwood supports, but inside, there's a heat that feels unnatural. He claims he recites Efjolkingi, an old magic passed down from his grandmother. Says it's a combination of prayer, poetic meter, and deep humming that stirs the warmth from the bones of the earth. You sit with him a while. He hums low and slow, and you don't fall asleep exactly, but time slips past like mist curling around your thoughts. When you step outside, you realize you've been warm the whole time. Coincidence? Another traveler you pass on the road carries a staff topped with a sunstone, a translucent crystal said to trap sunlight and release it slowly over time. Historians still argue whether sunstones were truly used for warmth or just for navigation, especially on cloudy days at sea. But this man swears by it, says it keeps his head from getting cold thoughts. You nod politely and continue walking, your brain slightly warmer for reasons you can't quite explain. As you head home under a sky that bruises purple with dusk, you tuck a little scrap of dried moss into your mitten. Not for insulation this time, but because the old woman at the shore whispered a blessing over it. She said it's from a patch that never freezes, even in the dead of winter. Said it remembers warmth. You know better than to take her literally, but you also don't toss the moss. That's the thing about warmth in this land of frost and lava. It's never just about temperature. It's fire and fleece and friction, sure, but also memory, belief, and the tiny, whispered things people do when no one's watching. Like stitching charms into seams, like chanting to the fire, like kissing your pendant before slipping it beneath your cloak. You step into your longhouse again, and the firelight greets you like a low hum of affection. You take off your gloves and feel the heat work its way into your fingertips, one sleepy inch at a time. You glance at the carvings on the mantel, some new, some faded. You've added your own, of course. Your own symbols, your own blend of survival and superstition. Because in a place like this, the line between warmth and magic isn't just thin, it's woven together like strands of the same woolen thread. And tonight, with the cold pressing in against the turf and the wind howling like forgotten voices outside, you wrap yourself in wool and whispered charms. And you sleep warm. By morning, your breath clouds the air inside the longhouse like slow-moving fog, even though the fire's not quite out yet. Embers glow under the ash like sleepy eyes half-lidded with dreams, and for a moment, you just watch them pulse, caught between sleep and waking, between frost and flame. You stretch beneath layers of wool, fur, and moss-stuffed bedding, and you don't rush to rise. Because the truth is, getting out of bed in medieval Iceland is an extreme sport. It's not just about warmth. It's about timing, teamwork, and sometimes sheer stubbornness. Rising routines here are strategic acts of survival. It starts with the fire, always. If someone didn't stay up late to feed it or wake early to stoke it, then mornings are basically endurance trials wrapped in ice. The first one up, usually the unlucky youngest or a rotating volunteer, has the thankless task of peeling themselves from the relative warmth of the communal bed platform and stepping into the Arctic tundra that is the rest of the house. It's like jumping into a frozen fjord while everyone else pretends to be asleep. That brave soul's job is to relight the fire if it's gone out. And while relighting sounds simple, it's a dramatic saga involving soot-covered kindling, possibly damp moss, flint, steel, and the emotional stamina of someone who hasn't had breakfast yet. That first flame is a kind of resurrection, one that determines the mood of the entire household. If the fire catches quickly, people are cheerful, talkative, maybe even sing a bit while putting on socks. If it sputters or smokes or refuses to light, no one makes eye contact until lunch. Once the fire is alive, it's breakfast time, but not the kind you might dream of. You get porridge, flatbread, dried fish, maybe a little butter if you're lucky, or if the cow's still producing despite the cold. The porridge, though, is surprisingly comforting. Often made from barley or rye, it's thick and steamy and sometimes sweetened with whey or berries preserved in honey. It sticks to your ribs and warms you from the core out. You huddle around the hearth to eat, knees touching, steam rising from bowls like tiny fog banks over hot springs. You notice, too, that warmth in the morning isn't only physical. It's social. Laughter helps. Complaints are a form of bonding. Someone jokes that the fire hates them personally. Another mutters that the porridge tastes like boiled moss, which honestly it might. But those shared grumbles carry heat. They're part of what gets you through. Once food is done, the house divides into its little morning rituals. Children drag on layers reluctantly, grumbling about the icy shock of wool against skin. Adults start their workday layering up like they're preparing for a polite battle with the wind. And layering is a whole system. You start with a soft undertunic, usually linen if you're lucky, then a heavier wool tunic, then a cloak, maybe fur-lined, fastened with a brooch or leather strap, then mittens, hoods, scarves. It's like building a personal fortress with yarn and sheep and sass. There's a debate among historians about just how regulated morning life was. Some say early Icelanders followed strict schedules tied to daylight hours, breaking fast at the same time year-round. Others argue that the darkness of winter changed everything, that people rose only once the light came or when the need did. And honestly, when the sun doesn't rise until 11 a.m., that argument feels pretty valid. Why rush into frostbite? In some households, especially those closer to trading ports, imported luxuries like soapstone pans or metal fire pokers made mornings a touch more bearable. But for most, it's just you, the fire, and the collective grunts of people trying not to curse before the sun's up. And there's always at least one family member who accidentally spills water on the floor, then stares at it while it freezes solid in front of everyone. A useful reminder that you're not imagining how cold it is. One particularly odd morning tradition involves what's known as the handstone warm. It's a small, fist-sized stone kept next to the hearth overnight, then slipped into your pocket or mitten before heading out. It doesn't stay warm long, but it's just enough to give you hope. Some even carried it on a string like a weird lava-laced necklace. The fringe belief was that if you named the stone after an ancestor, it would keep you doubly warm out of family loyalty. Heat and guilt, apparently, are a powerful mix. Outside, the world is frozen, but not still. Snow squeaks underfoot. Smoke curls upward from turf roofs in slow ribbons. You catch glimpses of neighbors heading out to tend animals, shovel paths, or chop ice from the water troughs. Some still wear the fire charm pendants from the night before, tucked under their tunics like secrets carried into the day. One man jokes that his pendant's working too well. It made him sweat through his shirt, which then froze. Icelandic humor again. Then there's the morning rituals connected to warmth that aren't about fire at all. People hug their animals, not always for love, though that's part of it, but for shared body heat. Cows and sheep are warm, sturdy creatures. Some farmers even build small enclosures inside the longhouse to sleep nearer to them in winter months. It smells a bit, yes, but it works. In fact, archaeologists have uncovered structural designs showing that some homes were built with shared walls between human and livestock areas, deliberately designed to let warmth pass through. It's kind of beautiful and kind of stinky, but mostly beautiful. You also start to notice something else during these cold mornings. People don't just dress for warmth, they move for it. Chores become exercise routines. Hauling wood, splitting logs, carrying water, none of it's wasted motion. It's all heat generation with a side of productivity. And when you're done, your cheeks are flushed, your blood is pumping, and your fingers feel almost like fingers again. Almost. One fringe practice you overhear involves warming your hands by placing them flat against a wooden wall facing the morning sun. Supposedly, the wall retains some of yesterday's heat, and if you press your palms there while whispering thanks to the old warmth, it blesses your hands for the day's work. A little absurd? Maybe. But as you press your own hands against the rough wood, you swear it works. Or maybe you're just desperate. By the time the full household is out and about, a rhythm has set in. People move like heat-seeking migratory birds, clustering near the sunlit side of the house, crouching next to steaming pots, fighting over the warmest seat on the bed platform like it's a throne. And yet, there's no complaining that matters, because this is the way of things. Morning isn't just a time of day. It's an ordeal, a daily reckoning with frost and fire. And still, as you step outside for your own chores, you realize something gentle and strange. You're getting used to it. The cold isn't an enemy anymore, it's a character in your story. A presence that makes every cup of warm milk, every successful fire start, every moss-lined mitten feel like a small but sacred triumph. And as you take your first deep breath of the frozen air, you exhale a cloud so thick it looks like a dragon sighing. And you smile, because you know the secret now. Warmth doesn't wait for the sun. It starts with fire, yes, but it continues with intention, ritual, humor, and just a little bit of magic. And in medieval Iceland, every morning is proof that even in a land built on frost, people wake, stretch, shiver, and carry warmth into the day anyway. Your boots crunch over a glaze of hoarfrost as you step beyond the doorway, breath fogging out in slow, ghostly clouds that dissolve against the sky. Outside, the morning light is low and blue, the kind that never quite commits to being day. You blink up at the sun, or what passes for it, hovering sheepishly behind layers of cloud and volcanic haze. It's not doing much, really, just kind of sitting there looking decorative. So you shift your attention to the real work, gathering and preparing fuel. Because without fuel, there is no fire, and without fire, there is only the shrill bite of Icelandic wind and regret. Fuel in medieval Iceland is a deeply creative endeavor. You're not exactly spoiled for choice. The island, shaped by volcanoes and salted by sea spray, isn't exactly lush with towering forests waiting to be chopped into logs. You can count the native trees on one hand, and by the Middle Ages, even those are mostly gone, harvested into history by earlier settlers with high hopes and dull axes. What's left is a patchwork of shrubs, driftwood, dried grasses, and moss. And it's up to you to turn that patchwork into heat. You start, like so many others before you, with moss. The soft, absorbent stuff you've seen tucked into bedding and shoes also pulls double duty as kindling and insulation for cooking pits. You gather it carefully from the lava fields and rocky hillsides, scraping it up with a wooden spatula that looks suspiciously like a spoon that gave up on soup. The moss is usually dried indoors for days before it's useful, laid out across rafters or hung in little bundles near the hearth, so it can soak up smoke and dry into crisp little curls. It smells like earth and ash, this moss, like something old trying to remember how to burn. But when you pack it together tightly, sometimes mixed with dried dung or seaweed, it becomes surprisingly competent fuel. This mixture is known in some regions as turf cut into bricks and dried, used to fuel fires for everything from cooking to metalwork. And yes, that means your stew might carry just a hint of moss and manure, like an ancient Icelandic seasoning. But you get used to it, sort of. Driftwood is the golden prize. Washed up by the sea, carried from Siberia or Greenland, it's a gift from oceans and gods alike. Strong, dry, sometimes even scented with salt or old fish. What a delight. When you find a piece, it's like striking oil. But finding driftwood is a patience game. You walk the beaches with your eyes on the horizon, waiting for something pale and straight to stand out against the black sand and kelp. Some folks even build little driftwood shrines to honor particularly large finds. It sounds silly, until you carry a log 4 miles uphill through wind that screams like a banshee and nearly takes your ears off. Then, you light a candle and say thanks to whatever spirit kept you upright. Another less glamorous but utterly vital fuel source is animal dung. Dried, broken into pieces, and stored in baskets, it burns slow and steady, perfect for baking or overnight warmth. It's not pleasant to collect, but it's dependable, and in the cold calculus of Icelandic winters, dependability is everything. You start to see the world not in terms of cleanliness or smell, but in terms of BTUs. And dung, dear listener, delivers. There's also a practice known in farming families as the ash shuffle, where ashes from the previous day's fire are carefully sifted and saved. Any unburnt bits, half-charred moss, stubborn chunks of wood get reused the next day. Nothing is wasted. You're not just burning fuel here, you're stewarding it, nurturing it, flirting with it a little. You lean in close and whisper sweet encouragement to reluctant embers because, in this house, fire is the closest thing to a deity you've got. Historians still argue whether medieval Icelanders imported significant amounts of wood from abroad or relied solely on local scavenging. There's some evidence of trade with Norway and Greenland, which may have brought pine or birch in small quantities. But for most people, especially inland farmers, it was all about making do. That meant burning what you could find, even if what you could find was a fibrous clump of dried seaweed that smoked like a dragon with bronchitis. You get better at spotting what burns well. Your eyes adjust to the subtle shades of moss, some more resinous than others, some with a spongy core that stays damp no matter what. You learn that certain seaweeds, when dried in the attic and twisted into rope, burn with a satisfying hiss and a smell like old pickles. You learn that even old textiles, torn tunics, worn-out cloaks, can be rolled tight and burned if things get really desperate. Not ideal, but again, survival trumps sentiment. And then there are the community practices around fuel. In some villages, neighbors pool resources, storing fire-starting materials in shared spaces or rotating fire-tending duties during particularly rough weather. One account even describes a fire watch rotation, where each household agreed to keep a flame alive and pass it along like a torch baton, in case someone's hearth went out during a storm. A literal fire safety net. It's not just practical, it's poetic. You also begin to appreciate the sheer ingenuity involved in fire maintenance. For example, there's a trick some families use called the ember pouch. It's a little leather or cloth bag filled with still glowing embers, wrapped in moss or wool, and tied off tightly to limit airflow. Carried carefully, it lets you transport fire from one place to another without starting an accidental inferno in your armpit. It's risky, but effective. And if done right, it lets you restart your hearth without needing flint or steel. A glowing pocket of yesterday's fire, nestled close to your ribs. Some even believed that moss harvested under a full moon burned cleaner and brighter. A superstition? Probably. But on a moonlit night, with silver light brushing the lava fields, you find yourself kneeling in the moss anyway. Just in case. Because when your breath freezes midair and the wind chews at your ears, you don't question the old ways. You just gather what you can and give thanks for every handful. You pause now, arms full of dried turf bricks, and look around. The longhouse smokes gently from its chimney hole, the curls of warmth rising into the pale sky. Behind you, the land stretches wide and bare, brown and white, like a parchment scrawled with invisible stories. You think of the people who came before you, the hands that dug this moss, the boots that wore this same path. You wonder if they curse the cold as you do, or if they found a kind of stubborn joy in outwitting it every day. A child runs past, barefoot somehow, trailing steam from her breath and laughter from her heels. She's carrying a bundle of twigs, already damp, but smiling like she's just won a game. You smile, too, because in this place, even the smallest flame is a triumph. And fuel, be it moss, dung, or magic, is never just about fire. It's about defiance. It's about keeping the cold from winning, one handful at a time. You step back inside with your arms full of moss bricks and turf, and the difference in air hits you like a warm sigh pressed into your cheeks. The inside of the longhouse smells of smoke, old bread, sweat, and that distinct mossy tang that clings to everything. You stomp your boots at the threshold, more for ritual than effect, and stack your cargo by the hearth, watching as a few flakes of frost evaporate instantly. And that's when you notice the corner of the room, a quiet knot of bundled figures bent over lengths of wool and bone, whispering while their fingers dance. Tonight is not just about heat from fire, it's also about heat from hands, from craft, from the warming power of weaving spells into things you wear. You sit nearby and let your body begin to thaw, fingers tingling with life again as the fire flickers higher. And here, in this moment of semi-warm bliss, you notice it. Someone is chanting under their breath as they threads a tuft of wool through bone. You lean closer. It's an old woman with silver hair and eyes like a winter sea, threading small loops through what appears to be a slipper sole. But it's not just mending, she's murmuring something with each stitch. A spell, maybe. A blessing. Or just a habit passed down from mothers and grandmothers, soft and rhythmic and half forgotten. In medieval Iceland, crafting clothing wasn't just a practical act, it was something closer to conjuring. The materials were scarce, the techniques intricate, and the purpose was more than warmth. It was protection, survival, and sometimes even spiritual defense. Wool was your second skin, but it could also be your armor against unseen forces. That's where magic slips in, not the dramatic kind with lightning bolts and cloaks, but the quieter magic that hums in stitches and lives in the rhythm of hands moving in the dark. Wool came mostly from sheep, of course, rugged, weather-resistant Icelandic sheep, with thick undercoats and long guard hairs that swayed like flags in the wind. Their wool was both soft and scratchy, depending on how it was processed, and every part had a use. After shearing, it was washed, carded, spun into thread on a drop spindle, then finally woven or knitted into garments, scarves, socks, mittens, cloaks, hoods, and of course, the famous lape pissa-style tunics, though those specific patterns came much later. Even so, the layering technique, thin wool undergarments, thick over tunics, and outer cloaks was common practice. You're handed a hood. It's not for fashion, it's for life. It's made of thick, greasy wool that repels water like a duck feather, dyed with lichen and iron filings until it takes on a green-gray sheen. You pull it over your head, and the scratch of the fabric is almost comforting. This isn't soft like modern fleece. This is stubborn warmth, earned warmth. You feel like it could hold up against sleet and ghost storms, and maybe it has. Some garments are stitched with runes hidden in the seams. Little symbols tucked where the eye won't catch them, but where the skin might feel them. Algiz for protection, Issa for endurance. Some say the runes held warmth in. Others claim they warded off spirits that whispered frost into your dreams. Historians still argue whether these runes were meant as true magical spells or simply folk symbols for luck. But the stitches are there, crooked and firm, sewn with fingers that believed in their power. Then there's the moss again, creeping into this chapter like an old friend. Not just fuel and bedding, but clothing too. Moss was sometimes used as insulation in shoes and mittens. You take a moment to imagine pulling on a mitten lined with dried moss, feeling that odd, earthy cushion against your fingers. It sounds itchy, but honestly, everything was itchy back then. The bar for comfort was, did it make you bleed? If not, it was probably fine, You're drawn now to another item, a pair of shoes that look more like soft leather sacks than anything else. They're hand-stitched, worn smooth and stuffed with moss and wool. These were known as skor, and they were often made from calf skin or fish skin. That's right, fish skin. In a place where nothing was wasted and everything had potential, even the shimmering hides of cod and wolffish were fair game. When treated and dried, fish leather becomes surprisingly tough and flexible, and it was sometimes used for shoes, gloves, or decorative patches. A young boy sitting nearby is stitching a new sole onto his slipper. He's maybe 10, eyes bright and focused, tongue poking from the corner of his mouth. His needle is carved from bone, and the thread is spun from sinew. He pricks his finger and doesn't even flinch, just wipes the blood on his tunic and keeps going. That's the sort of toughness you build when every step outside could mean losing a toe to frostbite. In many households, crafting clothes was a group activity, a fireside affair. The rhythm of the loom, the quiet clack of bone needles, the scrape of scissors made from sharpened shears, all of it filled the air between stories and songs. Sometimes, spells were murmured into the wool before spinning. Other times, charms were woven into the warp threads of a tunic's hem. There's even a story of a woman who knitted a pair of socks during a storm and buried them under her doorstep to keep the wind away. Did it work? Who knows? But the wind never broke her windows again. Of course, some items were too precious to wear every day. There were festival cloaks, dyed with imported woad or madder, trimmed with little bits of silver thread or beads made from puffin bone. These were stored carefully in boxes lined with birch bark or tucked into loft corners. Brought out only for weddings, naming ceremonies, or the thing, those great legal assemblies where people settled disputes and presumably tried not to freeze mid-argument. You pick up a pair of mittens that feel twice as heavy as they should. Inside, you discover a small lump, an amulet, maybe, sewn into the lining. It's a carved piece of antler, etched with a spiral. For luck, someone murmurs behind you, or maybe for warmth, which is the same thing, really. You slip your hands into the mittens and feel the lingering heat from the last person who wore them. There's something intimate about that, as if their defiance of winter is still stitched into the seams. Sometimes, warmth came from more than the physical. There were stories of women who sang the wool as they spun it, long, droning tunes that helped maintain rhythm, but were also said to imbue the fibers with protective energy. If you've ever hummed to yourself while doing a boring task, you know the spell. The repetition becomes trance, and suddenly the act is more than survival. It's art. It's worship. It's connection to every woman who ever sat in the dark, spinning hope from fleece. By now, your body is fully warm again, and your skin hums under layers of scratchy, beautiful, soul-sheltering wool. The longhouse glows golden. Firelight plays across the worn beams, and the moss bricks crackle quietly. Around you, garments are being passed from hand to hand, each one carrying a piece of someone's time, someone's breath, someone's prayer for a tomorrow that isn't frozen. So you wrap your new hood tight and let it sit heavy over your shoulders. The cold is still outside, howling and hungry. But in here, there is resistance. In every stitch and scrap, in every prick of the needle and whisper of spell. This is how you stay warm when the gods forget your name. You don't just dress for the weather, you weave against it. The fire burns low now, and your breath still hangs faintly in the air, but you're wrapped in warmth pulled from sheep, soil, song, and stubborn will. Around you, the hum of voices drifts into silence as people begin to settle, burrowing into cloaks and lying on thick beds of moss, skins, and straw. But your mind stays awake, tugged forward by the whispers you heard earlier, the spells muttered in wool, the runes hidden in seams. You can't help wondering what other kinds of magic Icelanders used to battle the cold. Not the warmth you wear, but the warmth you summon. The kind you don't hold in your hands, but in your breath, in your sleep, in your fear of what the cold might bring. Because out here, magic isn't a luxury. Its survival strategy #87. So let's talk about Galdrar, those ancient Icelandic spells and chants that weren't necessarily meant to dazzle, but to work. The word Galdr literally means incantation or spell song. And while it's often associated with sorcery, many Icelanders practiced these rituals as part of everyday life, particularly during the long winters. When it's dark for 20 hours and wolves howl through the lava fields, you don't roll dice. You whisper to the wind and hope it listens. You carve symbols into sticks and tuck them under your bed. You learn to trust the invisible. You shift under your mossy blanket as someone nearby reaches for a bundle wrapped in sealskin and tied with horsehair. Inside are tools, a small knife, a bone stylus, a board of pale driftwood etched with tiny markings. And there it is, your first glimpse of a stave. These magical symbols, called Galdrastafir, were drawn to invoke specific powers: protection from frostbite, safe passage through blizzards, success in fishing, warmth in the middle of ice-bound nowhere. Some were complex and spiraling, others stark and simple. Each one was a kind of visual prayer, drawn with blood, ink, or even spit, then burned into wood or scratched into skin leather worn beneath clothes. One of the most famous warmth-focused staves was called the Veldisman, a stave meant to grant power and protection to the wearer. It was often inked onto a piece of hide or bark and then pressed against the chest, either inside clothing or stitched into a cloak's lining. Some even claimed it warmed the body from within, raising not just temperature, but spirit. Historians still argue whether these staves were ever meant to be literal or if they were symbols of intent, early psychological survival tricks dressed up in runes and hope. But does it matter, really? If believing a symbol could keep you warm helped you push through the storm, then maybe that belief was the warmth. You pull your blanket tighter, and your hand brushes something sewn into the moss-stuffed edge. A coin. No, not currency, too worn and thin for that. It's a charm. Probably meant to protect whoever sleeps here from the cold spirits. Because yes, those existed too. Icelandic folklore is full of Vidir, spirits of the land, the wind, even the snow. Some were helpful, others less so. There are stories of frost spirits who crawl through the floorboards to steal warmth from your bones, spirits who hate laughter and creep closer to quiet houses. So people whispered charms, carved protective runes on door frames, and even left offerings in the corners of their rooms to keep the cold at bay. Not just in temperature, but in spirit. There's a fringe tale, definitely not in your standard history books, about a sorcerer who once conjured a pocket of springtime warmth using nothing but moss, blood, and breath. Supposedly, he created a circle in the snow where no frost could enter, where his sheep could graze even in January. Was it true? Hard to say. But people still talk about that glade, tucked somewhere near the shadow of Hekla, where moss grows green even in winter. You could go looking for it, but you'd probably just end up with frostbite and a cool story. Not all warmth magic was flashy or rune-carved. Sometimes it was in how you arranged your sleeping spot. Icelanders knew that heat rises, so beds were often built into raised platforms lined with turf, or dug slightly below floor level to trap warmth. Some even laid hot stones wrapped in moss near their feet. Others brewed herbs, angelica, birch, juniper, and poured the warm steam into closed spaces. And yes, people absolutely slept together, packed in like runestone sardines, not out of romance, but because body heat is stubborn magic all its own. You want to survive the night? Get cozy with Grandma and the goat. You lie back and think about that. How warmth became community. Magic was never solitary here, it was collective. It wasn't about dramatic cloaks and fireballs. It was about whispering a stave over your neighbor's blanket, about passing on the chant that keeps fingers from going stiff, about teaching a child which herbs to boil and which stones to bless. Magic didn't live in towers. It lived in kitchens, bedrooms, fields, and frost-nipped outhouses. Some staves were protection from cold. Others were for finding heat. There's a rumored lost stave called hirisikja, the heat-seeking stave, supposedly drawn in a spiral with inward lines meant to pull warmth toward the bearer. No surviving examples exist, but references show up in 17th century grimoires passed secretly among rural sorcerers. Whether it worked or not, just knowing such a symbol might exist must have comforted someone staring down a blizzard from the doorway of their sheep barn. You sit up and look around. The longhouse is dark now except for the embers and the low glow of moss lamps, but you know you're surrounded by magic, not the fantasy kind, but the daily, desperate kind. The kind that says, "I see you, Winter, I'm still here." And maybe that's the most powerful spell of all, refusing to disappear into the snow. You notice someone tracing a shape onto the wooden wall with their fingertip. It's a quiet gesture, reverent. You watch the motion repeat, loop, cross, sweep. It's not inked, not carved, just remembered, just done, like a sigh against the chill, a boundary drawn against the invisible. And you realize you've probably made a stave yourself before unknowingly. Maybe when you traced your finger around a cold mug or doodled spirals on a foggy window. Something ancient in the hand remembering what the mouth forgot. There are even stories, whispers, really, of people using warmth spells to protect unborn children. Women drawing runes onto their bellies, or midwives carving galdrestaffir into birch bark and setting it under the bed. In a world where childbirth and winter were equally dangerous, any extra shield was worth the risk. And magic, even quiet magic, was an act of defiance, of hope stitched into fear. You feel that now. Not fear exactly, but respect. The cold still howls outside, and the wind presses against the walls like a forgotten god trying to find a way in. But you're still warm. Your skin tingles with lingering heat, your breath soft against the air, and your heart steady with the rhythm of all those who survived before you. With moss, with wool, and with spells whispered like lullabies. Because here, in medieval Iceland, warmth isn't just fire and fabric. It's something older, deeper. It's the stubborn song of survival hummed through frost-bitten lips. The echo of a stave drawn in invisible ink. The comfort of knowing you're not the first to freeze, and you won't be the last to fight back. The fire gives a lazy crackle as the wind tries, once again, to pry open the seams of the turf roof overhead. You're still curled up in the warmth of your borrowed furs, but tonight your thoughts drift somewhere else, deeper into the ways Icelanders fought cold, not just with spells and sheep, but with their very homes. Because it's one thing to light a fire or carve a charm. It's another thing entirely to build warmth into the bones of your dwelling, to create a space that holds heat like a secret and hugs your body through the frost. You may think your thermostat does a decent job back home, but out here, a few clever architectural tricks meant the difference between comfort and, well, icicles forming in your nose. Welcome to the world of turf houses. These homes didn't just shelter you, they insulated you with the patience of centuries. You might have seen pictures. Low, grassy mounds nestled into the earth like oversized hobbit holes, their rooftops draped in moss, their walls thick with layers of sod, stone, and wood. But from the inside, they feel nothing like mud huts. They're warm, womb-like, cocooned against the relentless howl of Icelandic winters. Every inch is engineered for heat retention, which makes sense since timber was scarce and winters were cruel. When you've got more volcanic rock than trees, you get creative. So here's how it worked. Icelanders would start by building a sturdy inner frame out of driftwood or the occasional imported timber. Then came the stone, often volcanic basalt or field stones stacked tightly together. Finally, the real magic, layer upon layer of turf blocks, cut from grassy fields and laid like bricks, their roots still intact, so they knitted themselves together over time like a living quilt. These turf walls could be more than a meter thick, which meant once the house warmed up, whether from body heat, fire, or sun, it stayed warm. The grass on the roof wasn't just decorative. It added another layer of insulation, held the sod together, and bonus, occasionally sprouted wildflowers in the summer. Who says survival can't have curb appeal? Inside, the layout was compact and communal. At the heart of the longhouse was the bathstofa, the main living and sleeping area. Basically, your one-room-does-all center for warmth, weaving, storytelling, and not freezing to death. Families would sleep together in wooden sleeping platforms built against the walls, lined with moss, straw, and woolen blankets. The close quarters helped everyone stay warm. Privacy was optional, but body heat was mandatory. And with little in the way of windows, because glass was, expensive and non-insulating, natural light was minimal. Most of the warmth came from oil lamps, body heat, and, if you were lucky, a small hearth in a side room, though many turf homes used smoke-filled fire rooms off to the side to reduce the risk of fire spreading to the rest of the structure. Cozy, smoky, and only slightly asphyxiating. Some archaeologists argue whether the turf houses of medieval Iceland were adapted from older Norse longhouses, or if they represent a unique Icelandic evolution. You can still see remnants of these structures today, preserved in places like Glomber or Skager, where sod homes have stood the test of time better than most stone castles. That's because turf, unlike timber, doesn't rot easily in Iceland's cold climate, and it's surprisingly good at shrugging off snow and ice. That mossy roof wasn't just quaint, it was smart. It grew with the seasons, repaired itself slowly, and sometimes even served as grazing space for adventurous goats. No, really. There are stories of goats climbing onto the roof and refusing to come down until bribed with dried fish. And let's not forget the floors. Some turf homes had dirt floors packed tight and dry, sometimes lined with wooden planks or layered with straw mats to keep feet from going numb. Hot stones were occasionally placed near sleeping areas, wrapped in wool or moss to radiate heat through the night. In wealthier homes or ecclesiastical settings, you might even find a rudimentary heated bench system, where warm stones were embedded under seating platforms to toast your backside just enough to stave off frostbite. Of course, no insulation system is perfect. Even with turf, the cold still found its way in. Wind moaned through cracks. Drafts slipped past the seams, so Icelanders became masters of plugging gaps. Woolen tapestries hung on walls. Heavy curtains were draped over doorways. People layered up with cloaks even indoors. One quirky practice involved stuffing sheep wool or moss into the joints between logs or stone blocks, not just during construction, but as part of ongoing home maintenance. Think of it as medieval caulking, itchy, earthy, and surprisingly effective. You stretch out now, feeling that soft, moss-stuffed edge again, and imagine someone centuries ago sitting exactly where you are, poking moss into a wall seam with a carved bone stick, humming to themselves, cheeks red from the wind but eyes steady with purpose. Keeping warm wasn't passive. It was a chore, a ritual, a way of life. There were no passive heating systems. You were the system. And maybe that's why Icelanders seem to carry their homes with them. Metaphorically speaking, every layer of clothing was an extension of the house. Every chant, every stave, every shared story was another brick in the mental hearth you built inside yourself. Fringe tidbit time. Some old tales suggest that certain turf homes were blessed during construction using a ritual that involved burying items under the threshold. A coin, a sheep's jawbone, sometimes even a small wooden figure carved with runes. The idea was to protect the house from cold spirits and wandering misfortune. Some even claim these buried charms radiated heat, not literal warmth, but the kind of protective aura that kept sickness and frost at bay. Historians still debate whether this was practical folk custom or Proto-Nordic superstition gone architectural. But hey, when you're freezing your face off, who wouldn't take a little extra luck? You shift again, imagining what it must have been like to wake up inside one of these turf homes on a snow-heavy morning. The roof huddled close above you, the walls thick and silent, a single beam of gray daylight squeezing through a smoke hole overhead. Someone nearby clanking iron pots, preparing dried fish and hot broth. The faint smell of damp wool and sweet moss and lingering smoke. The outside world a white blur, but in here, safe, snug, and still warm from the bodies that shared your space. This wasn't just shelter. It was armor. Memory. It was survival made into sculpture. And just when you think the turf house couldn't get more clever, here's one more trick: airflow channels. Some homes were designed with built-in vents or slits under the eaves to allow smoke to escape and fresh air to cycle in without dropping the indoor temperature too much. It wasn't perfect, but it helped avoid the slowly smoke yourself in your sleep problem that plagued earlier fire room designs. Again, historians disagree on how widely this was used, or whether it was just a lucky coincidence in certain ruins, but the idea of ventilation that doesn't sabotage your insulation feels like the architectural version of a really good riddle. So now, as the wind howls and the stars twinkle behind a gauze of frost outside, you know that you're resting in the echo of something brilliant. Turf homes weren't primitive. They were perfect for this place, this climate, this life. They were cozy, yes, but they were also clever. They were expressions of defiance and adaptation and quiet brilliance. And whether you lived in one for a season or a lifetime, you learned to feel grateful for walls that breathed with you, floors that hugged the ground, and roofs that grew green above your head like a promise of spring. Not bad for a bunch of grass and rock and hope. You open your eyes for a moment, listening to the wind gnawing at the turf like an impatient dog outside. But inside, it's still and dim and womb-warm, like someone wrapped the entire world in a mossy blanket. And tonight, as you breathe in that faint, earthy smell of damp soil and wool, tonight, you wonder about how they kept warm not just with moss and houses and flame, but with what they ate. Because Icelandic food was never just about flavor. It was about fire from the inside out. Calories weren't culinary, they were survival. Let's be real. If you were living on a windy island near the Arctic Circle with no central heating and an overabundance of volcanic rocks, your top priority would probably be eating something, anything, that gave you enough internal warmth to avoid becoming a popsicle in your sleep. And the Icelanders knew this intimately. Their entire cuisine developed around keeping the cold out by feeding the heat within. Fat, fermentation, and function reigned supreme. So no, there weren't 5-course dinners with delicate sauces. There were slabs of boiled meat, gobs of animal fat, barrels of pickled fish, and a metric ton of dairy. This was food as thermal armor, and every bite was a defense strategy. Start with the meat, primarily sheep, because Icelandic sheep were small, hardy, and good at two things: growing thick wool and feeding a family. Mutton was roasted, boiled, dried, or smoked. Nothing went to waste. You'd eat the blood, the organs, even the head, especially in a dish known as esvith, a singed and boiled sheep's head served with the eyes still in if you were lucky. Or unlucky, depending on how you feel about ocular protein. Rich in fat, dense in calories, and surprisingly tender, esvith was both a delicacy and a declaration. We're not just surviving, we're feasting on the frost. And then there was fermented shark, hakarl, the infamous, ammonia-scented, semi-toxic delicacy that even modern Icelanders approach with caution. Greenland shark meat is poisonous when fresh due to high levels of urea. But if you bury it for a few weeks, let it rot, dry it, and then slice it very thin. Voila. A chewy, high-protein, high-fat survival snack that doubles as a test of personal courage. Historians still argue whether hackarl was ever really common in medieval times or if it became more prevalent later, but its roots reach back far enough to make your nose twitch just thinking about it. Of course, they weren't just carnivores. Dairy was a cornerstone of warmth-based nutrition. Think thick, rich skyr like a tart yogurt but sturdier. Butter was churned with obsession and eaten by the spoonful. You might think butter was a garnish. Not here. In Iceland, it was eaten straight or slathered thick onto barley flatbread. Some families even preserved butter in barrels, letting it age underground for years. Yes, years. The longer it aged, the more prized it became. This rancid butter, called Meisinger, could have a flavor strong enough to knock you over, and still people ate it like gold on a spoon because it was packed with fat, flavor, and heat. There are actual medieval accounts of butter being used to settle disputes, offering a rare aged butter as a peace gift, or refusing to share as a declaration of full-on blood feud. The grains were minimal. Wheat was rare and expensive. Rye and barley were more common, often imported or coaxed out of the soil in warmer periods. Bread was flat, dark, and dense, sometimes baked in geothermal springs by burying the dough in hot soil and letting it cook slowly. These breads were heavy, rich in fiber and calories, and tasted of earth and smoke. If you ever try it, don't expect fluffiness, expect sustenance. Each bite feels like it came with a contract promising to keep your stomach warm for 6 hours minimum. And then there's the fish. Salted, dried, smoked, boiled, you name it. Fish wasn't just food, it was currency. Dried cod especially, known as hardfisker, was a staple. Chewy, salty, sometimes eaten plain, sometimes dipped in butter. It could last for months and weighed little, which made it perfect for both travel and trading. Picture a medieval Icelandic kid gnawing on a strip of dried fish like it's beef jerky, using the calcium-rich bones as makeshift toothpicks. You laugh now, but you'd be grateful for that protein when your eyebrows are freezing mid-blink. Drinks, mostly sour whey or mace, which sounds fancy but is really the leftover liquid from making cheese. It was acidic and protein-rich, stored in barrels, and often used as a preservative, too. Imagine drinking something that tastes like liquid cheese tang with a vinegar chaser. Not glamorous, but it kept your gut running and your body warm. Alcohol wasn't especially common in early Icelandic history, but there were meads and ales in richer households, brewed from honey or imported grains. And in some sagas, they drink it in feasting halls so smoky and warm that you can almost smell the spiced brew and damp wool mingling in the air. Fringe time. Some households kept a chunk of dried fat wrapped in cloth near the hearth, and every visitor had to touch it and say a blessing. No one's entirely sure why. Some say it was a charm for abundance. Others say it was a quirky way of sharing energy, like, here, touch my sacred lard and stay warm. Historians still debate whether it was symbolic hospitality or proto-Christian ritual meets Old Norse practicality. But it's hard to deny the strange warmth of it, a gesture so earthy it feels almost holy. And while we're on rituals, did you know some food preparation involved murmured charms? Not spells exactly, but blessings woven into the act of stirring porridge or slicing meat. You'd say things like, "Let this broth shield the bones and soothe the marrow," or "May this skyr silence the winter wind." You don't get that from microwave popcorn. These were meals cooked with both heat and hope. You shift again, belly full of imagined meat and moss-baked bread, and realize that medieval Icelanders weren't just eating to live, they were feeding the fire inside themselves. Every bite was a miniature furnace. Every spoonful, a whispered resistance against the cold. And sure, maybe they didn't have cinnamon rolls or lattes, But when you're buried in snow and wrapped in sheepskin, a steaming bowl of barley stew with chunks of lamb and wild herbs might as well be ambrosia. Of course, not everyone had access to this feast-level nourishment all the time. Winters were long, and food storage was vital. Fish was strung up in attics, meat salted in barrels, milk turned into hard cheese or soured until it could walk on its own. Storage pits dug into the earth acted like medieval refrigerators, and in some cases, people quite literally buried food in the snowbanks outside their door, which sounds efficient until a fox comes sniffing around and leaves paw prints leading straight to your precious stash of winter cheese. Icelandic food security was a delicate balance of planning, preservation, and praying to the weather gods. So the next time you sip hot soup or wrap your hands around a buttered roll, remember this. Warmth didn't just come from fires or furs or turf. It came from what you swallowed, what you shared, what you blessed with your breath as the snow drifted past the window. In Iceland, to feed someone was to heat them. To eat was to survive. And survival, in all its steaming, fatty, fragrant glory, was the most delicious rebellion against the ice. You feel it first in your fingertips, the memory of warmth baked into stone, bone, and broth. But now let's slide deeper into the world of wool, not just worn but worked, not just wrapped around you, but built into your days like a ritual. Because in medieval Iceland, textiles were everything. Wool wasn't just your winter coat. It was currency, comfort, culture. And the people who spun, wove, dyed, and stitched it into life carried Iceland's survival quite literally on their shoulders. You step into a smoky, dim-lit longhouse where someone is carding wool by hand. The scent of lanolin, earthy, sharp, unmistakably sheepy, fills the air as tufts of raw fleece are coaxed into something soft, even beautiful. It starts so simply, with tufts of greasy wool pulled from a sheep that earlier that week was probably eating moss off your roof. Icelandic sheep were, and still are, something special. Small, stocky, built like fleece tanks, they grew a double coat, a coarse outer layer called tog, perfect for sturdy fabrics, and a soft inner layer called thel, prized for undergarments and cozy cloaks. No part went to waste. You separated, cleaned, and combed it with a patience only long winters could teach. Once the wool was ready, the spinning began. Using a drop spindle, no fancy spinning wheels here, not yet, you'd twist that fiber into thread with a rhythm that was hypnotic, almost meditative. Round and round, the spindle dangles and dances, fingers working as if on autopilot, passing warmth into future warmth. It was mostly women's work, though boys and older men might help with cleaning or weaving in emergencies. And in a land where time was marked by snowfall and sheep births, spinning was a way of measuring hours, even years. Historians still argue whether some of the old spinning chants carried hidden meanings, codes of courtship, protection, or just cheeky jokes about neighbors who couldn't card fleece properly. And you didn't just make clothes, you made your own currency. Literally. Woven wool cloth called vathmal was used in trade and legal settlements. You want a horse? That'll be so many ells of vathmal, measured and judged for quality just like coins. Too loose a weave, and you'd be laughed out of the marketplace. Too tight, and you might be accused of cheating. It had to be just right, standard width, standard thread count, and everyone knew someone who tried to sneak in a shortcut and ended up with a very cold winter and no cheese. Dyeing came next if you were feeling fancy. Most Icelanders wore undyed grays, browns, and creamy whites, colors of the sheep themselves. But those with means or time might dabble in plant-based dyes, lichen for yellow, madder root for red, though often imported, or even seaweed for greenish tones. Some would bury dyed wool in the earth to age, it darkening the colors through fermentation and soil chemistry. Fringe alert, some say certain families kept secret recipes for dyeing cloth that doubled as protection spells, with herbs chosen not just for color, but for the spirit they imbued. No one agrees whether these were true protective textiles or just really expensive capes with good PR. But either way, the stories linger. Once thread was spun and dyed, it was woven on upright looms that took up half the house. If you've never seen one, imagine a vertical wooden frame, threads stretched tight like harp strings, with weavers dancing through them with heddle rods and shuttles. It's not silent work. The creak of wood, the thump of the beater, the occasional muttered curse when the threads tangle, it all blends into the rhythm of life. You could weave for hours in near darkness, guided more by feel than sight, because the body remembers what the mind forgets. And yes, your back hurts just thinking about it. Now, the real fun, sewing. Needles were bone or bronze. Thread was sinew, wool, or linen if you were lucky. Garments weren't just sloppily stitched together. They were tailored, layered, and often decorative even when practical. You might wear a woolen tunic over a linen shirt, with a cloak fastened at the shoulder by an iron or bronze brooch, part fashion, part survival mechanism, part don't steal my only good cloak. Women wore dresses with apron panels and belts for hanging tools, pouches, or knives. Footwear was sheepskin, often wrapped and tied rather than shaped, and mittens were essential. Some were even knit using a method called nail binding, an ancient looping technique predating modern knitting. Think crochet meets sorcery. Textiles even carried status and story. A finely woven cloak might signal wealth or alliances. Embroidery could be plain or pictorial, and some designs hint at mythological symbols: ravens for Odin, curling dragons, or runes stitched in secret places. Historians still argue whether some of these embroidered patterns had legal meaning or whether they were just the medieval version of "this tunic is my emotional support garment." Either way, you didn't just wear warmth, you wore messages. But textiles weren't just worn, they were everywhere. Blankets, sacks, tents, saddle padding, even baby slings. And perhaps most intriguingly, burial clothes. When someone died, they were often wrapped in wool, either their best garments or specifically made shrouds. Imagine stitching a tunic knowing it would one day accompany someone into the afterlife. That's not just tailoring, that's legacy with lint. Some burial sites reveal clothing so carefully made and preserved that archaeologists now use it to reconstruct entire patterns and dye practices. And if that doesn't impress you, remember, you're lying there in fleece-based armor, surrounded by stone and snow, and the thing that'll last the longest isn't your bones, it's your wool cloak. Then there's the long cold room, where the finished cloth was stored, hung up, rolled, or packed in tight bundles, sometimes sprinkled with herbs to deter moths, and sometimes hidden in secret nooks for trade or dowry. In sagas, more than one feud erupts over missing wool, because when winter tightens its grip and the sheep are shivering harder than you, that bundle of Vathmal isn't just fabric. It's survival, it's food on the table, it's social leverage. One good cloak might get you through the storm. One missing bolt might start one. Here's a wild little whisper from the fringe. Some oral tales say that wool stolen during the dark of winter could never be warmed again, that it would always itch or feel damp no matter how it was cleaned or worn, a kind of textile curse. It might sound superstitious, but if you've ever put on a damp wool sock in January, you know some fates are worse than folklore. So next time you wrap yourself in a blanket, consider the layers of labor it once took to wrap a body in warmth. It wasn't passive comfort. It was hours of spinning and weaving by firelight, fingers chapped and aching, lungs full of smoke and wool dust. And all of it, every fiber, done with a single goal in mind: keep the cold out, wrap the warmth in, wear your resilience on your sleeve, quite literally. Because in Iceland, to clothe yourself was to declare, "This cold may howl and bite and bury the world, but I will not shiver quietly. I will wrap myself in sheep and fire and keep going." You wake to the hush of deep winter, wind tamped down under thick snow, the sound outside as muffled as your thoughts. The fire's glow has faded to coals, and your breath puffs out in little clouds. And yet, somehow, you're still warm. Not from the fire, not from sheepskin alone, but from something older, deeper. Because when the snow piled high and the wind roared through the rafters like a hungry beast, Icelanders didn't just rely on flame or fleece. They summoned something stranger, something woven into the land and their lore. Welcome to the shadowy corners of Icelandic folk magic, where heat could be summoned with words, signs, and secrets passed in whispers. You stir from your slumber, with a strange symbol flickering in your mind. It's not quite a rune, not quite a letter, more like a spell drawn in ink or ash. These were the Galdrestafir, magical staves, often carved into wood or stone or even traced into skin with soot. The most famous of these warmth-bringing sigils was Veldisman, a stave said to grant protection and strength, though some whispered it could also shield the bearer from cold. You'd inscribe it onto driftwood, carry it in your belt pouch, or sketch it into the corner of your doorway with a sheep bone dipped in blood. And while historians still argue whether these staves were practical magic or spiritual placebo, no one denies their importance. They were symbols of hope in a place where winter always tried to win. But not all magic was drawn. Some of it was sung. You murmur an old galder, a chant spoken in rhythmic, breathy tones. These weren't just lullabies, they were incantations. You might whisper one before bed, over a kettle of soup, or into the walls of the house before a storm. One particular chant, passed from grandmother to granddaughter, was said to lock the fire inside the bones, so you'd stay warm even when the embers died. No one agrees on the exact words anymore. Too many versions, too many tongues, but fragments linger in lullabies and lull-like prayers still hummed today. And then there were the herbs. Not just for tea or tincture, but for spell work. Angelica root was the darling of the magical herb shelf, used in warmth spells, healing salves, and fever-banishing smoke. Juniper, too, was burned in tight bundles to cleanse the air and supposedly push out the cold spirits that crept in at dusk. You might keep a pouch of dried moss, bog myrtle, and thyme tucked into your bedding, not just for scent, but for protection. Sages said the moss held warmth from the sun longer than the soil itself, and sleeping on it made your dreams immune to frost. Whether that's true or just a poetic excuse to avoid straw bedding, well, you'll have to test it yourself. Not all warmth magic was cozy and innocent, though. Desperate times bred desperate charms. One grim tale involves the Nabrock or Necropence, a legendary piece of magical clothing made from the skin of a dead man's legs, stitched together and worn like trousers. Supposedly, they brought unending wealth and warmth to the wearer, but only if a coin was placed in the scrotum before wearing them, and the ritual was followed precisely. Now, no one truly believes someone actually pulled this off, probably. But the myth lingers like a chill under the collar, and you can't help but wonder how many rituals started with good intentions and ended with a slightly too warm curse. There were other ways to coax warmth from the world, too. You could speak to the land. Stand barefoot on the threshold at dawn and whisper your worries into the earth, hoping the hidden folk would hear. These Hulju folk, Iceland's elusive hidden people, were sometimes blamed for sudden cold drafts or blessed for mysteriously keeping a room warm when no fire burned. Offerings were left on windowsills, milk, bread, a pinch of salt, and in return, warmth might linger longer than it had any right to. Some claim these weren't just fairy tales, but metaphors for respecting the balance between seen and unseen forces. Historians still argue whether belief in hidden folk was a form of psychological survival or a literal faith in invisible neighbors. But either way, you didn't ignore them. Not if you wanted your fire to stay lit and your soup to stay hot. Even the architecture held magical intention. Longhouses were built with symbolic orientation, the hearth at the heart, the entrance facing away from the prevailing wind, the beams often marked with hidden runes or charms for protection. Some houses were built over stones considered warm by spirit, stones that had once housed fire spirits or fallen stars. These weren't your standard building materials. These were talismans embedded in the floor. You probably wouldn't notice unless you were told, and then you'd notice the way your toes never quite froze over that patch near the hearth. And if you couldn't warm the body, maybe you could trick the mind. Sleep rituals often included mental journeys. You'd lie beneath your heavy woolen blanket and imagine a fire, visualize it until you swore you could feel the heat on your cheeks. Some say this was an early form of meditative trance or dream walking. Others say it was simply desperation dressed up as tradition. But it worked. You slept warmer. You dreamed brighter. You woke, at least, not frozen. But perhaps the most important warmth magic wasn't found in staves or herbs or incantations. It was in shared breath. The way bodies huddled together under skins and blankets, the way children nestled between parents, the way stories filled the air like invisible firelight. A tale told by a warm voice on a cold night is a spell all its own. One that warms the blood and hushes the dark and tells the ice, not tonight. So you sit by the hearth, wrapped in a blanket stitched by your grandmother's grandmother, a bundle of moss tucked beneath your neck, and a lullaby older than the language you speak humming in the back of your mind. The snow outside can rage all it wants. You've got symbols in your pocket, herbs in your stew, warmth woven into your sleeves, and magic that doesn't care what century it is. And that warmth you feel, that's not just firewood. That's everything you've ever believed in, holding the cold at bay. The wind picks up again outside, slow at first, then rising into one of those long, moaning sighs that seems to come from the mountain itself. You're not afraid. You know that sound now. You know it's just the voice of winter trying to get in, and you know it won't win. Not tonight. Not while you're curled under layers of moss-stuffed wool, next to the embers of the fire, in a house held together by bones, dreams, and a touch of very old magic. But still, you pull the blanket up to your chin, just in case. Tonight, though, isn't just about surviving the cold. It's about the full cycle of warmth. Not just fire and fleece, not just closeness or chant, but how the people of medieval Iceland built an entire life around staying warm in the harshest place imaginable. You feel it in the way their stories always circle back to the hearth, how their laws made space for those frozen by fate, how their sagas never leave the reader out in the snow. Warmth wasn't just practical, it was cultural. It was the standard. It was the whole point. You remember the woman in the turf house from earlier, the one who carefully stacked lamb bones, stirred milk into moss soup, and scratched runes into the lintel above the door. She didn't see warmth as a moment, but as a rhythm of tending, layering, adjusting, checking, adding, over and over again every single day. She would have laughed if you'd called her a magician. But she was. She was keeping people alive with methods both mundane and mysterious, and she knew how much of survival was invisible. Like the way you don't notice your nose hasn't gone numb until you step outside and it does. And then there's that quirky little fact about cod liver oil, how it wasn't just for health, but often taken warm before sleep to insulate the body from within. You'd hold your nose and tip it back, shivering from the inside out as it slid down your throat. It sounds awful, and, well, it was. But you'd fall asleep faster and wake up warmer. And you can't help but wonder if the psychological boost helped more than the oil ever did. That's the thing about old solutions, they weren't just about function. They were about feeling. And belief carries heat all its own. Even their language leaned toward warmth. The word H-lit, meaning warm, wasn't only about temperature. It was used for kindness, for welcome, for peace. A H-lit home was one that sheltered more than the body. It shielded the soul from sharp things, from the chill of silence, the frost of isolation. When someone said stay warm in Icelandic, they meant stay whole, stay human. Of course, warmth could be weaponized too. Some Galdr included cold banishment curses against enemies or rivals, not just the kind that made your toes ache, but the sort that left someone forgotten, out in the cold socially, economically, spiritually. And while historians still argue whether these rituals actually worked or simply served as cautionary tales, there's no denying the metaphor was effective. In Iceland, being left out in the cold wasn't poetic, it was lethal. You sit with that thought for a moment. That warmth, as lovely as it is, always has an edge. That to stay warm, someone had to gather the wood, shear the sheep, gut the cod, soak the moss. That someone, probably many someones, died figuring it all out. Every warm bed in medieval Iceland came with a cost. And every time someone lay down under a shared blanket and whispered a lullaby against the icy dark, they were also whispering a promise. I'll keep you warm if you'll keep me alive. And still, the fire flickers. You glance around your imagined turf house, and for a second, you can almost see the shadows of those who came before you. Someone crouched by the door, beating snow off their boots. Someone else humming while grinding herbs into a steaming brew. Maybe a child in the corner, tracing invisible runes into the air with their finger, just because they can. You breathe in deeply and realize the air smells like peat, juniper, and old sheep wool. And it smells like safety. That's the real magic, isn't it? Not the staves or chants or even the clever ways of trapping warmth in moss. The real magic is in the ritual of care, in doing the same small things every day to make sure the night doesn't win, in pulling someone closer instead of pushing them away when the cold creeps in. That's how medieval Icelanders kept warm, not just with moss and fire, but with each other. And now, the wind dies back to a whisper. The fire hums gently in the hearth. The moss beneath you feels impossibly soft, like memory or lullabies passed down in the bloodstream. You are warm and you are held, not just by the walls of this little house, but by centuries of people who figured out how to endure winter with stubborn tenderness and a little moss magic. You shift under your blanket and let your body relax fully now, your last waking thoughts settling into the long drift of dreams. You'll wake in the morning, or what passes for morning in these dark, northern months, and you'll stir the pot, adjust the fire, shake out the moss, just like they did. But for now, you sleep. The night outside can do whatever it wants. You're not afraid, you're warm. And now, as the final echoes of Icelandic winds fade into the stillness of your room, let's let everything settle. Your shoulders sink just a little deeper. Your breath eases out, longer and softer now. You've wandered through turf houses and moss beds, traced runes into the smoky air, and listened to old songs hum against thick wooden beams. All of that, yours to keep now. Little flickers of warmth you can call back any time the night feels too wide. Picture that slow-burning hearth again, not too bright, just a low amber pulse like a heartbeat for the house. There's nothing more you need to do, no moss to shake out, no charms to whisper, just rest. Let the world outside drift further away with each breath. You are safe here, wrapped in the quiet wisdom of old ways and gentle traditions that once held off the harshest winters. And they still do. You might even find yourself imagining the sound of distant hooves, crunching through snow, or the creak of wooden beams stretching in the frost. These aren't things to fear. They're just part of the rhythm of the land. The same rhythm your body is syncing with now. Slow, gentle, unhurried. Your thoughts are welcome to float now, light and untethered. There's no need to follow them. Just let them pass like snowflakes through the dark. Soft and weightless. You've done enough, you've heard enough. You've felt enough for tonight. Let every corner of your body exhale, fingers, toes, even the space between your eyes. There's no cold here now, only that deep, steady warmth that lingers when stories are shared and old secrets are remembered. It's okay to drift, to let go of the edges. So whether you're curled up beneath actual wool blankets or just wrapped in the softness of your own quiet, you're exactly where you need to be. Still, warm, whole. Thanks for coming along on this little journey through frost and fire, moss and magic. I hope it brought you a little closer to peace, or at least gave you something lovely to dream about. Wherever you are, however cold the night may seem, you've got this glow now. Let it carry you through.